The Philippines has called out China. China's response is clearly not good. CCP has a nasty habit of stretching its borders and claiming territories that don't belong to it. Unfortunately, it's made a big mistake by choosing the Philippines as a victim this time around. In the past couple of weeks, tensions have been really high in the South China Sea, as Philippine and Chinese Coast Guard ships are reporting multiple collisions in the region.
As a Chinese Coast Guard ship collides with a 97-meter Philippines vessel, the Philippines Coast Guard says one of its largest vessels sustained widespread damage.
Both sides are blaming each other for the collision. According to the Philippine government, the Chinese Coast Guard vessel hit a Philippine Coast Guard vessel 3 times.
First, real quick, we need your help. CCP bots are fighting hard against this type of content, and we need your help to fight them off. Please leave a quick like on this video to help us push against the YouTube algorithm so we can continue to bring you informative content. On the 19th of August, several Chinese and Philippine vessels collided near the Sabina Shoal, with the Chinese Coast Guard claiming that the Philippine vessel deliberately collided with them. The shoal, which has been claimed by China as Jianbinjiao and as Escota Shoal by the Philippines, is located some 75 miles from the Philippines' west coast and 360 miles from China. This incident was followed by a second round of collisions with both sides once again blaming each other. The Philippines claimed that the Chinese Coast Guard vessel 5205 intentionally rammed into the Philippines vessel. On the other hand, the Chinese claimed that the Philippine ship was illegally stranded at the shoal and deliberately rammed into them. Another incident also occurred on the 26th of August, where the Philippines claimed that 40 Chinese ships prevented 2 of their boats from conducting a humanitarian mission to restock the Teresa Magbuana, a Philippine Coast Guard ship deployed months earlier to the shoal. Again, China continued with its rehearsed defense that its actions on the sea have been professional and appropriate. The running theory by the Philippines is that China is attempting to reclaim land at Sabina Shoal, with reports that Beijing is using that raw material to expand the shoal. Of course, China's denied this, stating that the claims are groundless and unscientific. Although these are the most recent incidents, China and the Philippines have been at it since the beginning of the year. We'll start with a small incident in January, where a Filipino fishing boat captain claimed a Chinese Coast Guard drove him away from Scarborough Shoal and forced him to dump his catch into the sea. The Scarborough Shoal is a triangular reef formation that is a source of contention because of its rich waters and marine resources. It's been the site of a lot of Manila-Beijing disputes in the past couple of months, and in May, 200 volunteers and 100 fishermen broke through the blockade of Chinese vessels and reached the shoal. Back at the Second Thomas Shoal in March, Chinese and Philippine Coast Guard vessels collided, injuring 4 Filipino crew members. Things got more dangerous in April this year when a Chinese Coast Guard ship fired water cannons at 2 Philippine patrol vessels near the Scarborough Shoal, which could soon overtake the Second Thomas Shoal as the 2 nations' biggest shoal fight. Again, in June this year, a Chinese Coast Guard rammed a Filipino resupply boat. The Chinese sailors were brandishing makeshift spears, which cost a Filipino soldier one of his fingers. The Philippine military chief, General Romero Bronner, stated that they were outnumbered and the Filipino crew had been unarmed and had fought with their bare hands. In response to these allegations, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian said that Manila's comments on the clash were bogus and that the Philippines was to blame. According to them, Filipino boats have been ramming into Chinese vessels. Beijing wants us to believe that their Coast Guard has been professional and restrained during the confrontation, and that no direct measures were taken against Filipino personnel. As we can see throughout this year, the interactions have moved from microaggressions to full-on fights. With fights persisting from the Scarborough Shoal, the Second Thomas Shoal, and the Sabina Shoal, it's clear that the Philippines and China are not seeing eye to eye in the South China Sea. There's always been tension between the 2 nations. But the fight for the shoals intensified in June last year, when Chinese soldiers attacked Filipino sailors with machetes and hammers while they were on their way to resupply their soldiers stationed on a warship. Footage has been released by the Filipino military showing Chinese Coast Guard officers brandishing an axe and other bladed or pointed tools at the Filipino soldiers and slashing their rubber boats. China and the Philippines have been fighting a lot in the South China Sea, 9 times in just August alone. But you might not have seen that news, because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitics news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, I send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all, this is completely free, and you can sign up now by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code. Both sides blamed each other for the confrontation, but knowing China, this was definitely one of their acts of aggression. We would think that by now China would have managed to win this border dispute. China's been known to bully smaller nations into a corner, but surprisingly, the Philippines has been giving it a run for its money. After the incident in June this year, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. stated, "We will never be intimidated or oppressed by anyone." He's pledged to continue to exercise our freedoms and rights in support of our national interests in accordance with international law. This lets us know that these disputes are probably going to be going on for a very long time. Now, if you've been a loyal subscriber for a while, you'll know that this is not the first time that China's come head-to-head with the Philippines in this area. We've discussed the most recent aggressions, but now I want to explain why the South China Sea is such a hot zone for disputes. Later on, we'll also shed a light on how the USA is tangled up in all of this. The South China Sea is a sea in the western Pacific Ocean that is about 3.5 million square kilometers. Its positioning is the source of contention as it's right in the middle of these 6 nations. The sea is south of China and Taiwan, between Vietnam and the Philippines, and north of Brunei and Malaysia. It holds 2 groups of islands, the Spratly Islands in the south and the Paracel Islands in the north. As you can expect, the dispute is territorial, as all 6 countries claim a part of the sea and the islands within it. China's claim of the islands is the largest, demarcating it by the so-called 9-dash line. These lines are based on a 1936 map by Chinese cartographer Bai Meichu. The line comprises 9 dashes that extend hundreds of miles south and east from its most southerly province of Hainan. China also claims that the territory has been part of it for centuries, including the Paracel and Spratly Island chains. Outside of the territorial issues with the island, there are other things that have made the South China Sea worth the fight. The South China Sea is one of the busiest waterways for global trade, with ships carrying an estimated 30% of global crude oil through it. What's even more interesting is that its seabed is believed to hold huge oil and gas reserves. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the sea is estimated to have 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. It's also home to rich fishing grounds, and more than half of the world's fishing vessels operate in this area. The Paracels and the Spratlys have been rumored to have reserves of natural resources around them. Specifically for China, the South China Sea is its second most used sea lane in the world after the Dover Strait, and 60% of its total trade and 80% of its oil imports transit through the region. To add to its appeal, on the tourism front, the islands of the South China Sea have a lot to offer. Beach resorts like the Philippines' Boracay have some stunning beaches and beautiful sunsets. The cruise tourism market is also booming, with ships operating from China, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines going into the sea. Having control over more islands in the region means being able to take a slice out of the tourism pie. Now, while all these things make the South China Sea a worthy territory, what's probably fueling the fire is the fact that the sea is such a strategic military location. Because the sea is so close to so many countries, many of them are looking to drop military bases and installations around islands and shoals. China's been camouflaging military ships on the sea, claiming that they're just fishing boats. Beijing's aim is for the ships to provide backup to the China Coast Guard and maintain a constant presence in remote waters. In addition to its military buildup, China has already built sea military bases on the Spratly Reefs while also flying its fighter jets above the sea. Now that we've looked at the reason for the numerous fights, let's trace out some of the earlier contentions for the South China Sea. China's aggression in the region and its claims have been a problem, as each of the 6 countries occupies at least one of the islands. As the CCP has become more militarized in its activities in the sea, Vietnam and the Philippines have been the 2 nations that have given China the most grief about its claims. In the 1900s, China and Vietnam fought for the region, with the two fighting for the Spratly and Paracel Islands. In 1974, China seized the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam, killing more than 75 Vietnamese soldiers in the process. In 2014, China moved an oil rig into Vietnamese waters, which sparked massive protests in Vietnam. What's worse is China's been known to arrest foreign fishermen and sailors in waters they consider to be their own. China's fights with Vietnam are few and spread out, but Manila and Beijing have been at each other's throats consistently throughout the years. In the early 2000s, the Philippines and China were at it, with things intensifying in 2013. Things got so bad that the Philippines filed a case against China at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. After a long back and forth, the Philippines Foreign Minister Albert Del Rosario stated that the Philippines has exhausted almost all political and diplomatic avenues for a peaceful negotiated settlement of its maritime dispute with China. The Philippines wanted the court to rule on what territorial claims it was owed in the South China Sea, and to determine if China had infringed on its territorial rights through China's construction and fishing activities. Since China's a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Philippines hoped that they could be held accountable. China refused to take part in the case, claiming that UNCLOS was beyond its jurisdiction. On July 12, 2016, the arbitral tribunal adjudicating the case ruled overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines, determining that major elements of China's claim, including its 9-dash line, recent land reclamation activities, and other activities in Philippine waters were unlawful. As you saw earlier in our discussion, the Second Thomas Shoal has been the main center of the dispute between China and the Philippines. The shoal is a reef that is about 124 miles from Palawan, Philippines, but more than 621 miles from China. It's been widely considered to belong to the Philippines because of how close it is to it. Unfortunately, China does not agree with this, despite the ruling by the International Tribunal that China had no legal rights to the shoal, which is in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The Philippines have had a military presence on the shoal since 1999, and they have no plans on moving anytime soon. The BRP Sierra Madre has been docked on it and has served as a base for some of its troops for many years. Despite this, China's been fighting for the tiny shoal, and many believe it's because its strategic location would be perfect for a naval base. Some even say that it could also be because the area has rich oil and gas reserves, but that is yet to be proved. This is all so messy, but now we're gonna take a detour to discuss US involvement in the matter. Although the US has no territorial claim in the South China Sea, they have been performing freedom of navigation exercises around the area. These are basically naval operations conducted by countries to demonstrate their rights to navigate through international waters. This is an international law right that's stated in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. One of the reasons behind this right is to challenge excessive maritime claims by asserting military presence and capabilities. The US has been carrying out these exercises in the South China Sea as a way of telling China to pipe down and show its influence. The US amped up its exercises under the Trump administration, and they've been sailing their vessels near or around features claimed by China. Washington's actions have been frustrating to Beijing, and in 2021, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson said, "It is the United States which has actually militarized the area and threatened freedom of navigation." The country, over 8,300 miles from the South China Sea, has built several military bases with offensive weapons around the area, and frequently sent aircraft carriers and strategic bombers throughout the year. One of the major reasons that the US has gotten involved in this maritime dispute is that it has a stake in the sea remaining open. With the freedom of the seas principle under maritime law, the US can enjoy movement in trade and for its military pursuits. If China gets to claim the South China Sea as its territory, the US and many other nations will not be able to use the waterway freely. The Philippines is also an ally of the US, so their involvement in the area is also to maintain stability. They have a mutual defense treaty with the US, which means that if the contention of the South China Sea turns to war, the US would be obligated to step in. We also need to look at the fact that despite China's feelings that the US is overly involved, the US has really been trying to stay neutral. Beryl Nowens, an executive director for Asia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, states that Responding to coercive actions in the gray zone is difficult precisely because the lines between peace and conflict are blurred. What's ensured that the US has kept its antics to a minimum is the fact that it also has been trying to reduce its tension with China. President Biden has made it clear that he seeks only to have friendly competition with China, and that America is looking to consolidate a friendship with China. This means that the US is towing a delicate line, and the Philippines will probably have to keep fighting its own battles in the region. As the fights between the two nations escalate at an alarming rate, we need to start talking about what could happen next. Things could escalate further, as there are reports that Beijing wants to implement a new policy that would authorize the Chinese Coast Guard to detain foreigners crossing into waters claimed by China. This is a direct violation of international law, and it could see more than just the Philippines going head-to-head with China. In the meantime, the Philippines is not lying idle. Manila is working on deepening its alliance with Washington, and the two countries have carried out military drills together. This also took place on an island chain in the northern Philippines with the practice launch of an anti-cruise missile that sunk a decommissioned ship. While the US has been neutral till this point, a strengthening of the alliance could be a sign that it may be willing to act with the Philippines in the near future. The Philippines has been carrying out a number of security drills and signing agreements with other countries like Australia and Japan. Currently, Japan and the Philippines are discussing a reciprocal troop access agreement, and the Philippines and Australia have upgraded their cooperation in maritime security. The Philippines is doing a lot of leveling up on the military front, giving China a reason to be afraid. Currently, it's a waiting game, and the next act of aggression will show us the intentions of the two nations. At present, Manila continues to record each incident and publicize it for the world to see. By showing us who China really is, the Philippines is preparing for the time that it does actually hit back. When it finally pushes China out with military force, the international community will be able to understand what led to that point.
Another possible threat rising in the South China Sea.
China does not want you to see. The United States says the superpower is reclaiming land.
Those territorial claims can be so scattered they almost appear like a game of Chinese checkers.
Chinese construction crews have been dumping massive amounts of white sand in 7 spots in the South China Sea.
And that's an issue for 5 neighboring countries and territories, including Vietnam and the Philippines.
Vietnam is ramping up its island building activity in Spratly Islands, part of which is being claimed by the Philippines.
Vietnam is getting ready to completely obliterate China. In a move that's bound to escalate tension, Vietnam has increased its island building in the hotly disputed South China Sea. Reports show that in the past 3 years, Vietnam has reclaimed 2,000 acres of land from the ocean, and since November 2023, it's already claimed 700 acres. With this land, Vietnam is working to slowly destroy China by building artificial islands and militarily expanding to be able to fight Beijing in a potential war. The most genius part of the plan is the fact that Vietnam has taken this idea straight from China, which has been building artificial islands in the South China Sea for years now, giving China a taste of its own medicine. So, what's Vietnam's secret plan for China's destruction? Who are the players in the fight for the South China Sea? How will all this play out? In this video, we'll answer these questions and more. We are constantly fighting CCP bots that downvote our content and leave negative comments on our videos. We'd appreciate it if you could support us by liking our videos and sharing them with your friends and family, too. Right, let's get into today's video. The reality is that China's a bully, and it was only a matter of time before a Southeast Asian country stepped in to do something about it. Take this story, for instance. In late September, 10 Vietnamese soldiers were attacked by China, and 4 tons of their catch was seized. Tian Fong, one of the fishermen, claims that 2 boats approached them from the rear and the front. The people in these boats got out and started beating up the fishermen with a 3-foot-long pole. 3 of them suffered grave injuries and had to be rushed to the hospital. This news caused a massive uproar in Vietnam, since the fishermen were in Vietnamese waters. This is not the first time that China's acted this way, and what we're seeing happen with Vietnam is in response to this type of aggression. Since 2015, Vietnam has been slowly building a base on its claimed islands in preparation for an attack against China. The Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative reported that Vietnam has already expanded dredging and landfill work at several of its outposts in the Spratly Islands. This has created about 420 acres, or 170 hectares in 2022. and comes to a grand total of 540 acres or 219 hectares in the last 10 years. The Spratly Islands that Vietnam has claimed are called Nam Yet Island, Pearson Reef, Sand Cay, and Tennant Reef. So far, these are the islands where the most amount of work is being done. To develop the area, Vietnam is using clamshell dredgers and other high-end construction equipment to scoop up parts of the shallow reef and deposit them in the areas where they want to create land. This development is going to make it possible for bigger vessels to land on the island, especially military ones. At 5 of the islets, which are basically small islands, new landfill work has already begun, with the purpose of creating small rigs and platforms on the islands. There are already 51 outposts spread across the islands, and at the rate of development, there's bound to be a lot more. Vietnam has also begun to add buildings to the major islets, and research by the US think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, shows that the work has included new communications equipment, a sports field, and the extension of a runway to about 1.31 miles or 1,300 meters on its largest holding on the Spratly Islands. The Bark Canada Reef, which is Vietnam's biggest outpost, has doubled in size over the past 6 months, from 238 to 412 acres. The reef now measures 2.68 miles or 4,318 meters, meaning it could potentially be used to build a 1.86 mile or 3,000 meter runway. China has runways of its own like this on Fiery Cross, Mischief, and Subi reefs. Vietnam's development of buildings and infrastructure on the islands has been uneventful, but the interesting developments that everybody's really concerned about are the military ones. The Chinese think tank, the South China Sea Probing Initiative, believes that Vietnam is trying to pretend like the work it's doing on the island is for civilian use, while it's actually building up the islets for military purposes. Vietnam has created 102 new acres of land at Discovery Great Reef, 52 acres at South Reef, 41 acres at Nam Yet Island, and 37 acres at Pearson Reef. All of this expansion has been for the purpose of turning these islets into military and logistical bases for the South China Sea. There's also been an increase of Vietnamese troops and civilians on these islands and reefs as Vietnam works swiftly to transform the territory into a military hub. The Strategic Probing Initiative carried out a detailed investigation of military activities on the Vietnamese claimed islands and came out with some shocking results. Naval Regions 2 and 4 of the Vietnamese Navy cover the Spratly Islands with 2 units stationed at Quan Do Trong Sa. Naval Region 4 has been on the islands ever since they were seized from China in 1978. These 2 units regularly carry out garrison and anti-landing operations on the islands and reefs, and have suspiciously stopped foreign ships from approaching them to gain control of the waters. What's even more alarming for China is the fact that over 2,000 soldiers have been deployed to defend the islands and reefs. The developments on the island are also extensive, with fortifications created by combining field and permanent fortifications. The military has also set up the ground battlefields, underground bunkers, and combat and living facilities. The islands with the most military presence are Spratly Island and Nam Yet Island, where battalion-ready units of troops are stationed. The artillery that's also been found on the island shows that Vietnam is not just looking to bolster an area of defense. The island has 4.8-inch howitzers and 5.8-inch cannons, T-34-85 medium tanks, PT-76 amphibious light tanks, and Type 63 amphibious light tanks. Vietnam has also created an air defense firepower with 0.9-inch and 1.5-inch anti-aircraft guns. While most of the artillery is old and from the Soviet era, it's still pretty useful. On top of all this, Vietnam also has a VRS-CSX X-band medium-range coastal warning radar system that can detect targets as far as 105 miles or 170 kilometers. All of this is just for 2 reefs, but there's more military presence, even on the smaller ones. On 11 other reefs, Vietnam has defensive facilities that are meant to form loose defenses. Each of these reef forts has a squad of soldiers stationed there with anti-aircraft machine guns, RPG-7 and Kalashnikov assault rifles, and several machine gun bunkers. This level of military expansion and fortification is not simple defense preparation. Vietnam has had a long time to watch China's aggression in the South China Sea, and it's clear that Hanoi is preparing to go head-to-head with Beijing. What's more interesting about Vietnam's strategy is that it's been taken straight out of China's handbook. Since 2013, China's built on a total of 7 Spratly Islands. China's been working tirelessly to try and fortify its claim of the islands, and images taken by a Filipino photographer, Ezra Akayan, show island bases that are considered to be unsinkable aircraft carriers. These bases are being used by the PLA to hunt submarines in the South China Sea. To fortify the artificial islands, China's also added more buildings, radars, and aircraft hangars. In the images taken by the Filipino photographer, you can clearly see military camps and large aircraft hangars on all 7 Chinese artificial islands. We need to go back a bit because these artificial islands haven't always existed. In order to be able to build its structures, China needed to establish more land on the sea. And since islands are made of sand, the task was pretty simple. To be able to construct these artificial islands, China began by building on top of already existing islands, rocks, and even coral reefs. On top of these existing structures, China basically poured a whole lot of sand using dredgers, which are basically ships that pick up material and move it from the sea floor. The mechanism of these dredgers is pretty advanced. The ships use large tubes with cutting attachments at the end to grind up material on the sea floor and suck it up. This material is then carried through the pipes or hoses and dumped on top of existing formations. Once the islands are big enough, China can then lay down cement and build structures on them. A lot of sand is used in the process, because in order to build important structures like military bases and airstrips, you need a whole lot of land. According to research by the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, China's man-made contraptions currently have almost 32,000 acres of new land. Unlike Vietnam, where parts of its islands are for civilian use, the entire 7 islands are being used for China's military capability. Photographs like the ones we showed you earlier revealed that the islands are so covered by military bases that they don't have space to plant a single tree. The military bases on the islands have missile systems, radars, runways specifically made to carry heavy aircraft, fuel storage, and naval facilities. With such an extensive military presence on their islands, it's no surprise that Vietnam's working hard to bolster its military presence too. According to Dr. Malcolm Davis, a defense strategy and capability senior analyst from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the resources concentrated on these Chinese islands give China enough power to overwhelm the Association of Southeast Asian Nations military. This is crazy considering the fact that this association includes Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. ASEAN's a regional organization that's working to promote economic growth and cultural development in Southeast Asia. This organization's had to deal with China's aggression in the South China Sea for a hot minute, and the fact that China's artificial islands have the power to project military power from northern Australia or into the Indian Ocean is the reason countries like Vietnam are soldiering up. China's aim in its military expansion is to fortify its claims that most of the territories in the South China Sea belong to it. Vietnam's aim is to solidify its territories and fight back against China's aggressive expansion in the region. Recently, we crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we've been flooded with emails asking us questions and advice about growing a channel on YouTube. Even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes these take up too much time. Or they ask the same question we've answered before. That's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email bootcamp for completely free. So if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can get your email bootcamp by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Now, back to the video. As Vietnam's continued on with its expansion, it seems that China's the only one bothered by its actions. Most of the countries in Southeast Asia understand Vietnam's objectives and stand by them. To them, China's actions are destabilizing because it's using its islands to harass Southeast Asian countries. According to Alan Chong, associate professor at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, they've never had, I think, a standoff with any other country, because all the other claimants have respectfully kept their developable spheres around the South China Sea. And I think there's this intra-ASEAN consensus that within ASEAN, the claimants do not rock the boat so as to present a common front towards China. Vietnam's been respectful of the territories that the Philippines and Taiwan have claimed, so they have no reason to worry. The way Beijing sees it, Hanoi's reinforcing illegally held features by land reclamation and military development, as well as setting up defenses and operating on these islands and reefs. Not surprisingly, China's reaction is very hypocritical. It acknowledges that the construction by Vietnam is not at the same scale or speed as China's, but still goes on to villainize their actions. Beijing actually believes that because Vietnam's been secretive and meticulous in its activities, the international community has more to worry about. These responses to Vietnam's expansion are from think pieces and articles, but the Chinese government has not responded officially to what's happening. When you think about it, China's silence could be very strategic. Bill Hayton, an associate fellow at the Asia-Pacific program of Chatham House, stated that, as far as we know, China has not tried to interfere with Vietnam's construction on these reefs. This is interesting considering what its reaction has been to the Philippines' attempts to reinforce the BRP Sierra Madre. The BRP Sierra Madre is a Philippine Navy ship that has historical and sentimental value from its time in World War II. It's become an observation point at the Second Thomas Shoal, but China has constantly attempted to blockade it. China's response to a Navy ship docked on an island and its response to Vietnam's military expansion is clearly disproportionate. On a diplomatic level, it can't outrightly condemn Vietnam's activities, so it's rather choosing to bide its time and wait for an opportunity to strike. It may also be that Beijing's not ready to escalate tensions in the South China Sea, and so it's chosen not to comment on Hanoi's land reclamation operations right now. Hanoi's making headlines now for its activities in the South China Sea, but its work in the area dates all the way back to 1975, when Vietnam occupied 5 islands and emancipated them under the name Quan Dao Trong Sa. Vietnam chose these specific islands because of their positioning and the potential they had for oil exploration and maritime trade. In 1998, the country also took over 24 islands and reefs, bringing its total to 29 islands. The first step for Vietnam was its land reclamation and construction project. It started in 2007, and at the time, Vietnam didn't have a lot to work with. It used excavators to build seawalls and cofferdams with coral sand in the shallow water, and then used excavators to dredge sand from coral reefs on seawalls from both sides. Next, Vietnam created breakwaters, which are basically used to protect an island from tides and currents. The stones used to build breakwaters at harbors were transported from Vietnam by sea. In its first stage, Vietnam expanded the area on the islands from about 140,000 square yards to 270,000 square yards. From this, they developed a harbor that could accommodate 1,000 tonnage vessels. After building this base, things accelerated in 2015, and all the construction we spoke about earlier took place. China's frustration probably stems from the fact that it didn't expect this level of development from Vietnam so quickly. As the friction between the two nations escalates, China is realizing that Vietnam could be a worthy contender in the South China Sea. While the focus is on fortifying claims in the region, there are some environmental concerns at play that nobody's recognizing. So let's talk about it. Coral reefs are beautiful ecosystems where thousands of sea creatures live. When you pile sand on top of them, you're basically killing these creatures. There's a loss of thousands of different species happening in the South China Sea because of the construction of these artificial islands. Professor John McManus explains the situation best, stating, "The sand and silt stirred up by the dredgers covers most of the lagoon, and it's settling out on most of the remaining reef. The sand will kill nearly any bottom-dwelling organisms on which it settles in large quantities and clogs the gills of most fish." The saddest part about all of this is that the damage done is irreversible. Corals that are buried under sand cannot recover, and this means that thousands of species in the sea could be destroyed. The destruction of corals has a domino effect on sea life, so let's walk through it. Construction causes a loss of natural sunlight to the coral reefs, which means the reefs won't grow. This leads to the rapid growth of harmful algae blooms. These harmful algae blooms reduce the oxygen available and induce acidification, which then leads to coral erosion. Coral erosion's a problem because migratory fish feed on the larvae in the corals, and if they have no food, there's no need to be there. The artificial building of islands in the area has led to a deep decline in fishing stock in the region. According to the Maritime Executive, fish stocks have declined by 1/3 and are expected to decrease by an additional 59% by 2045 if current practices persist. This means that livelihoods are at stake if this continues. For most countries in the Indo-Pacific region, fishing is a source of employment and sustenance. On a national level, countries' food security and GDP contributions could be affected by this construction. With all that being said, environmentalists report that the way that Vietnam has been building its islands has been less environmentally taxing than China. According to the AMTI, Vietnam's method is considerably less damaging to the wider environment. Though, of course, destroying 520 acres of coral reef is still quite bad for the environment and fisheries. The environmental aspect is not as important for China and Vietnam because its focus is political. The battle for the South China Seas has more players than just Vietnam and China. For China, all of its territorial claims are fueled by the idea of the 9-dash line. Based on this, China claims the Spratly Islands, Paracel Islands, Scarborough, and other reefs on the sea. China's legal claim is basically that it called dibs first. It asserts that the South China Sea was discovered in the 3rd century and mapped out by Chinese scholars. This is backed up by the fact that there is evidence from some of the islands of Han Dynasty-era artifacts. Because of this evidence, China feels that any other claims that have been made are illegitimate. Every time any other territory tried to assert a claim in the sea, China would push back. In the 1900s, China and Vietnam fought for the Spratly and Paracel Islands. China won this particular fight in 1974, when it seized the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam and killed more than 65 Vietnamese soldiers in the process. The fight for the Paracel Islands began in 1973, when China began to assert its claims of the island. During the battle, Chinese frigates engaged the South Vietnamese ships and sank them. Although Vietnam kept parts of the Spratlys, it completely lost the Paracels here. Things got a lot more serious in 2012 when China began to snatch away more islands, which started a quarrel between China and the Philippines over the Scarborough Shoal. Not being able to come to a resolution, the Philippines filed an arbitration case with the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. The basis of the claim was the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which China is a signatory to. At this stage, the Philippines had tried everything, and this was a last-ditch attempt at saving the situation. The Philippines wanted the court to rule on what territorial claims it owned in the South China Sea, and to determine if China had infringed on its territorial rights through China's construction and fishing activities. The problem was that China refused to take part in the case, claiming that the UNCLOS was beyond the jurisdiction of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. On July 12, 2016, the Arbitral Tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines, determining that major elements of China's claim, including its 9-line dash, recent land reclamation activities, and other activities in Philippine waters, were unlawful. The ruling did very little for the Philippines, and China continued on as if nothing had changed. The disputes between China and the Philippines have gotten so intense that both of their coast guards have reportedly been attacked. In August, there was a reported case of Chinese and Philippine vessels colliding near the Sabina Shoal. The Chinese Coast Guards claimed that it was the Philippines vessel's fault and that it had deliberately hit them. Then again, in that same week, a second round of collisions took place and both sides claimed innocence. China's claim was that the Philippine ship was illegally stranded at the shoal and deliberately rammed into them. The attacks between the two countries are not even limited to just their coast guards. In January, a Filipino fishing boat captain claimed the Chinese Coast Guard drove him away from Scarborough Shoal and bullied him into dumping everything he'd caught into the sea. The Philippines has consistently fought back against China's bullying tactics, and in one incident, about 200 volunteers and 100 fishermen broke through the blockade of Chinese vessels and reached the shoal. At first, it was friendly fire and a few jabs here and there. But there have been occasions when Chinese Coast Guard ships fired water cannons at Philippine patrol vessels. In one dangerous instance, a Filipino soldier lost one of his fingers. Then we have China's confrontations with Taiwan as well. China's anger with Taiwan in this case is the fact that it allows the US to use its claimed islands for military purposes. Taiwan and the US have worked closely in the South China Sea to push back against Chinese aggression. In response to this, China has attacked Taiwan's claimed islands, accusing the US of militarizing the South China Sea through its air and naval patrols. Vietnam has been watching all of this unfold and has realized that China's a bully that needs to be stopped. Its confrontations and incidents with the Philippines and Taiwan seem like small disagreements, but Vietnam understands that it's important not to underestimate China. This fight's also about the influence in the region for Vietnam. Its militarization in the region is also aimed at fortifying its claim in the South China Sea, too. According to Na Pham, a Vietnamese journalist, the official narrative is always that Vietnam is doing some small-scale construction to strengthen weather shelters for fishermen and to prevent erosion. But it's all being done by the military, and it's fair to say that Hanoi's been militarizing its maritime features, but at a much slower pace and at a scale far smaller than that of China. The South China Sea is one of the busiest trading routes in the world, and Vietnam also wants a slice of the pie. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, more than $5.3 trillion worth of shipping travels through the sea each year. and $1.2 trillion of this trade belongs to the United States. This is why nations like Vietnam and the Philippines are fighting so hard against China's territorial claims. If China's left to expand, it will be in control of this shipping route. The South China Sea is also full of hidden resources, and the potential in the region is endless. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, there are about 11 billion barrels of oil in the South China Sea, as well as 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. As we discussed previously, the region's very important for fishing too. China's as aggressive as it is in the region because a large part of its economy is centered on fishing. Currently, China accounts for 17.4% of the world's marine. The runner-up is Indonesia, and China makes 3 times more than it does. All this makes the battle for the region pretty intense and fuels Vietnam and China's rapid military expansion in the Spratly Islands. The increase in military expansion by Vietnam in the Spratly Islands is a definite cause of concern for China. Before 2015, land reclamation was happening gradually, but after that, Hanoi's expansion has been rapid. The most concerning of its actions is the movement of artillery to the islands, which is a clear sign that preparations are underway for something. While China may have chosen to let this slide for now, it must be noted that this rapid expansion by Hanoi is telling of potential plans for invasion. In February 2024, the aviation industry of China displayed its Z-10 attack helicopter for the first time at the Singapore Air Show. After displaying their beloved Z-10, aka Fierce Thunderbolt, the PLA made the bold assertion that its helicopter was superior to its foreign counterparts. A Chinese state media outlet, Global Times, reported that the helicopter had outstanding flight performance, low air maneuverability, firepower, survivability, ergonomics, and reliability. This is significant for China because it's its first attack helicopter, which is said to have a range of around 695 miles and an empty weight of about 11,243 pounds. On top of claiming that the helicopter is superior, China has also stated that the helicopter was domestically developed. This is very interesting as people have identified that it looks a lot like the American Apache helicopter. In this video, we're going to dissect these 2 claims that China's made and discuss the scandal that has been surrounding the famous Fierce Thunderbolt. CCP bots are always at work trying to downvote our videos so that you, as our audience, don't get true and honest content. To help us fight back, give this video a like and share it with your friends and family too. Right, now let's get into today's video. Okay, before we go into talking about the Chinese Z-10 model, let's talk about the American Apache helicopter that everybody's comparing it to. During the Cold War, the US Army needed a helicopter that could hunt down tanks and other threats so that they could be taken out from a distance with a missile. After a lot of research and designing, the US began flight testing in the 1970s, and the AH-64 Apache was first approved for production on April 15, 1982. And as they say, the rest is history. Boeing, the creator of the fighter helicopter, released a statement in March 2023 celebrating that the Apaches had surpassed 5 million flight hours. It's been more than 3 decades since its first flight, but the Apache is still the top-ranked attack helicopter in the world. There's an extremely high demand for it, and it's used by countries like the UK, Egypt, India, and Taiwan. Now we're going to talk about why it's the top-ranked helicopter in the world. Unlike most fighter jets, the Apache's tandem seats sit higher to the rear while a weapons officer and co-pilot sit closer to the nose. During the night, the pilot is guided by an excellent PNVS wide-angle infrared night vision system for navigation. The gunner also has an infrared camera that's fitted with a laser target on the Apache's nose. The body of the aircraft is well protected by 2,500 pounds of light boron plating and Kevlar-lined seats, which can deflect 0.5-inch bullets and 0.9-inch flat cannons. Even the fuel tanks of the aircraft are protected by a self-sealing protection system. The helicopter is equipped with 2 1700 T700 GE701 turbo shafts, which are on either side of the body. Another distinct feature of the aircraft is its stub wings, which can carry anything from 2.75-inch rockets to quad racks of AGM-114 Hellfire anti-tank missiles. Outside of its impressive design, the Apache has earned its title because of the extensive hours it's spent in combat. The fact that it's still the top choice for a lot of countries proves its formidability. After going through the details of the American Apache, let's now talk about the prized Z-10. The Z-10 attack helicopter was developed by the Changhe Aircraft Industries Group and the China Helicopter Research and Development Institute for the People's Liberation Army. Its primary purpose is air-to-air combat in anti-armor and battlefield interdiction situations. The layout of the plane is the same as that of a conventional attack helicopter, with a nailed-down fuselage and stepped tandem cockpits. This cockpit has room for a gunner in the front and a pilot in the rear on ejection seats. The body of the aircraft has a sloped side and is tapered to the rear for a reduced radar cross-section. The helicopter has a 5-bladed main rotor and a 4-bladed tail rotor with 2 engines that are mounted at the back of the cockpit. It's 46 feet long with a rotor diameter of about 42 feet and a height of 12 feet. At takeoff, the maximum weight that the Z-10 can carry is 8 tons. In terms of its readiness for the battlefield, to withstand bullets, the cockpit's protected by composite armor and a bulletproof glass canopy that can take 0.3-inch rounds. The modern glass cockpit is also equipped with multifunctional displays, a helmet with night vision goggles, and a fly-by-wire control system. These control systems are important because they help pilots to communicate with flight control surfaces. Some versions of the Z-10 can also be fitted with forward-looking infrared, a low-light television, and a radar system. In terms of the weapons it can carry, it's compatible for use with the newly developed HJ-10 anti-tank guided missiles. The helicopter also has the capacity to carry about 8 anti-tank guided missiles, 8 TY-90 air-to-air missiles, and 4 PL-5, PL-7, and PL-9 air-to-air missiles. The Z-10 can hold multi-barrel unguided rocket pods and has 4 pods under its subwings that can carry 2.2 to 3.8-inch rockets. According to Global Times, a group of 4 Z-10s can carry 32 anti-tank missiles, 8 2.2-inch caliber multiple rocket launchers, and 4 guns, which is enough to wipe out 3 tank companies. The electronic countermeasure system is quite impressive, and it contains a radar warning receiver, a laser warning receiver, an infrared jammer, and a flare decoy launching system. The engine, which is a PT6C-67C turboshaft engine, is another important part of the aircraft, and it has a maximum continuous power of 1,142 kilowatts. In August 2024, a picture emerged online showing a PLA Z-10 attack helicopter flying with a KG-300 GEW electronic warfare pod. The Z-10 was flying alongside a Russian-origin Mi-8 helicopter, and the pod could be seen under the left stubwing. As of 2024, the attack helicopters have been incorporated into the Chinese arsenal and are ready for use during war. In preparation, the helicopters have been used by the country's army aviation units for exercises near Taiwan and India. However, in terms of exports, Pakistan is the only country that has acquired the helicopters so far, making it the largest user of Chinese-manufactured defense systems. From a description of the specs of the American Apache, we can tell that it's going to take an out-of-this-world creation to compete. Since China's made the bold assertion that its Z-10 is a cut above its counterparts, let's compare it to the American Apache attack helicopter. Pictures that have been released of the Z-10 show that it resembles both the Apache helicopter and the Bell's Invictus Future Attack Reconnaissance aircraft. The Apache helicopter is a veteran fighter plane that has been used by America since the Gulf War. The multi-mission twin-engine helicopter was first flown in 1975, and since then, Boeing has been upgrading and developing them for the U.S. Army. Like the Z-10, it has a 4-blade main rotor and an armored cockpit. It's equipped with 2 T-7GE701C engines and has advanced sensors and avionics. The latest version of the Apache helicopter is the AH-64E, which has improved engines and sensors. Another model that Z-10 gets compared to is the Bell Invictus helicopters. These are fairly new, and they're part of the U.S. Army's new Future Attack Reconnaissance program. This helicopter is a lot more modern and designed for stealthy operations. If we were to compare the fuselage, the Apache helicopter loses to the Bell Invictus and Z-10. The Z-10's side structure and shape increase the ability to be covert during missions. On the other hand, the Apache is more rectangular and angular, making it unfit for stealth exercises. Like the Z-10, the Bell's Invictus is rounder and smoother, in a deliberate effort to lower its radar signature. Its shape allows it to blend more naturally and be less detectable to radar return signals. If this was the battle for the stealth fighters, the Z-10 would win because its center and back end are more rounded and its body blends better. In terms of range, the Z-10 has a further range of 497 miles, while the Apache's is only 295 miles. However, the Apache beats the Z-10 at speed, reaching 226 miles per hour, while the Z-10 only reaches 186 miles per hour. The body of the Z-10 is lighter at 7 tons, and the Apache weighs a good 10.4 tons. Ultimately, the Z-10 is unique because it's a mix of different technologies and helicopter designs. However, determining whether it is superior is difficult, as there's not enough data on its experience to compare it to a veteran like the Apache, or newer models like the Bell Invictus. Currently, it's not a direct competitor in terms of global military helicopters, but it could be in the next couple of years. The next assertion we're going to tackle is whether China's Z-10 was domestically developed. We'll take a look at the history of its development to determine if China can really say that the aircraft was homegrown. Recently, we crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we've been flooded with emails asking us questions and advice about growing a channel on YouTube. Even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes this takes up too much time, or they ask the same question we've answered before. That's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email bootcamp for completely free. So if you're someone who's interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can get your email bootcamp by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code in the description. Now, back to the video. Developing this specific style of fighter helicopter was important because of China's terrain. On the northwest side, China has high-altitude desert regions, and in the southwest region is China's Qinghai-Xizang Plateau. China needed to develop the Z-10 so it could handle China's high-elevation border regions. China began development in the 1990s and invested about $500 million into the project, which was a lot more money back then. Originally, the project was purely domestic, and manufacturing was done by China's aviation industry and the military's 602 Research Institute. As time went on, China realized that it was not self-sufficient and it needed help. Certain parts of the helicopter needed to be imported, and China had to turn to its foreign counterparts for assistance. The problem was, China was not a people's favorite at the time. Russia had no interest in selling China its Mi-24 helicopters, and the US was not cooperating. China had initially been able to secure an agreement to purchase AH-1 Cobras from the US, but the deal was cancelled because of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and massacre. China became very unpopular after this because the Chinese government deployed troops to massacre students during a peaceful protest. The US Congress also prohibited the export of any defense articles to China under the Tiananmen sanctions, so China couldn't import any helicopter technology. Although this slowed down its progress, things started looking up for China when Eurocopter France assisted them in developing their rotor system. The South African arms manufacturer Denel also provided technical assistance to the project based on its experience in designing the Denel Royal-Valk, while the British-Italian company Augusta Westland assisted with the transmission technology for the helicopter. From the looks of things, this project was a group one, and many countries contributed to the final design. Publicly, China was claiming that the 602 Research Institute was in charge of the project, but Russia's rotorcraft manufacturing company Kamov was the brain behind the design of the aircraft. Under a secret contract, Kamov designed everything from the weight, speed, and payload capacity of the helicopter. After the initial early-stage designs were done, Kamov handed everything over and testing and further developments were done by China. Now, the engine development for the helicopter is where all hell broke loose between the US and China. China had its eyes on P&WC's turbo engine, but knew that there was no way they would get it legally. The US embargo meant that no American company was allowed to export such technology to China. Unfortunately, Pratt & Whitney Canada, which is a subsidiary of United Technology Corporation, was a big US defense contractor looking to make a quick buck. So initially, P&WC found a loophole that allowed them to deliver 10 engines from Canada to China in 2001 and 2002. Their excuse was that this sale did not go against the US's military embargo because the engines were identical to the ones it was supplying China with for its commercial helicopters. After this, it delivered advanced engine control software to China through its Connecticut-based subsidiary Hamilton Sundstrand. These designs allowed China to test and develop the P&WC engines for their military helicopter. It took the US 6 years of investigation, but it finally nailed P&WC for the crime. The case against P&WC and its subsidiaries was because the company had endangered US national security in an attempt to access China's civilian helicopter market. P&WC was aware of the fact that China was going to use the software to develop its military helicopter program, but it chose to look the other way so that it could benefit. The U.S. Attorney David Fine commented on the case saying, PNWC exported controlled U.S. technology to China, knowing it would be used in the development of a military attack helicopter in violation of the U.S. arms embargo with China. PNWC took what it described internally as a calculated risk, because it wanted to become the exclusive supplier of a civilian helicopter market in China, with projected revenues of up to $2 billion. The hearing was held at a federal court hearing in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The decision led to United Technologies and its two subsidiaries, Pratt & Whitney Canada and Hamilton Sunstring Corp., agreeing to pay over $75 million to the U.S. government for criminal and administrative charges. $20.7 million was for criminal fines, forfeitures, and other penalties, and $55 million was for payments to the State Department. In the end, United Technology accepted full responsibility for the violations and said that it spent $30 million and hired more than 1,000 employees to help with internal export oversight. This scandal completely blew China's domestic production claim right out of the water. One of the reasons why China continued with the lie that the helicopter was developed locally was to bypass international arms embargoes and restrictions that blocked China from importing certain parts. Another reason was probably that China was too proud to admit that it needed everyone's help to develop its first attack helicopter. Pretending it did it all on its own also instilled national pride in the Chinese people, and support for the People's Liberation Army increased too. The PLA's obsession with the PNWC's engine was its full-authority digital engine control, which is basically a control system with no manual overrides or manual controls. This means that the engines run independently and allow them to reach a range of about 756 miles. Armed with the designs from PNWC, China was able to build a full helicopter, and in April 2003, the Z-10 had its first flight. The maiden flight was completed at Lumeng, and by December 2003, all test flights had been concluded. In 2009, the first operational helicopters were sent to the People's Liberation Army, and Wu Zhengming, the chief designer, claimed that the Z-10 was in the world's top 3 gunships. While no one can deny the blood, sweat, and tears that China put into developing the attack helicopter, claiming that it was domestically developed is a stretch. After the PNWC fiasco, China lost its ability to use its engines for later models of the Z-10. So it started developing its own version of the WZ-9 turboshaft engines. Interestingly enough, these engines weren't independently designed either. With the assistance of Ukraine and Russia, China was able to develop a turboshaft engine of its own. The new engines have slightly less power than the PNWC engine, with a power of about 1,000 kilowatts. Domestic production was a lot cheaper, and the low operational costs and freedoms from international politics seemed to be worth it. On top of the assistance with the engine, the Bureau of Russia also helped to design the helicopter airframe. Looking at the evidence, it's clear that there was a lot of input from the outside, and China was able to perfect what it had because of all the insight it had from different countries that had produced fighter aircrafts of their own. In 2020, China unveiled an upgraded variant of the Z-10 attack helicopter in service with the People's Liberation Army Ground Force. The new model is fitted with different exhaust outlets that point upwards instead of outward. This new design is to help reduce the helicopter's infrared signature as seen from the ground. China may want to maintain that its processes and operations are unique and indigenous, but some of its systems have been borrowed from the US. Let's look at the fact that even the operation of the helicopter fleet is similar to that of the American system. The US Army includes a combat aviation brigade in each of its divisions to ensure each battalion is covered on the ground and in the air. So far, the PLA has created 15 aviation brigades, which means that about 13 of its groups have aviation brigades. Each Chinese brigade will have around 80 of these helicopters, which is similar to what the US does. In terms of quantity, the US combat aviation brigades have about 1,200 Apaches in service, meaning they have a higher ratio of helicopters to soldiers. Another way that China seems to have copied the US is in the operation of its fighter helicopter. Beijing claims that it ran some war games and decided that the helicopter should be commanded by the Army and not the Air Force. This could just be a coincidence, as the US military runs their attack helicopters the same, and now China's created a People's Liberation Army Ground Force Air Force Go-2. Another interesting similarity between the two operations is the fact that in its recent developments, China's had to ditch its low anti-tank missile for something similar to what the US Apache uses. The US Apache uses the Hellfire missile, which is the primary weapon used by the US for air-to-ground attacks, and it's done so for a very long time. All of these operational similarities point to the fact that China's tried to model its new attack helicopter with the Apache attack helicopter in mind. The US should take this as a compliment because imitation is the greatest form of flattery. We've already squashed the idea that China's Z-10 is better than the Apache, but let's see how it compares to other fighter helicopters. In a statement by China Central Television, the report stated that, thanks to its good aerodynamic design, domestically made engines, excellent handling, and maneuverability, the Z-10 is easier to control, has a longer range, and a better multitasking capability than its foreign counterparts, like the Eurocopter Tiger. Let's test this statement by comparing the Z-10 to the Eurocopter Tiger. This helicopter is a collaboration between France, Spain, and Germany, and it was created by Airbus Helicopters. It's a versatile copter that has been used for army reconnaissance, anti-tank operations, and close air support. It also has a four-bladed hingeless main rotor to allow for the execution of full loops and negative maneuvers. The Tiger's been around for a lot longer than the Z-10, so it definitely has an operational edge. Both helicopters have the same range of 497 miles, and in terms of speed, the Z-10 is slightly faster at a speed of 186 miles per hour, while the Tiger moves at 181. There's also not much of a difference in weight, with the Z-10 weighing 7 tons and the Tiger weighing 6. The comparison shows that the Z-10 specs could definitely compete with the Eurocopter, but actual combat will give more insight. Let's take a look at an opinion on the attack helicopters and see where China stands objectively. According to AeroCorner, the Apache is the most successful attack helicopter of all time. Its success rate has earned it this position, and its ability to be used in different environments is impressive. Just making the top 10 at number 10 is Russia's Ka-50, which is a single-seat attack helicopter in Scout. It has a unique dual rotor and was the first helicopter with an ejection seat in 1995. It's a very powerful gunship with many versions that have worked well for air-to-air combat. According to this ranking, China's Z-10 comes in at number 15. Aerospace notes that the Z-10 is impressive because of its cutting-edge technology and its modern design. While 15 is not the highest on the list, this is quite high praise for a fighter aircraft that is yet to be seen in action. A stock take of China's arsenal shows that they have over 150 Z-10 helicopters in service, and these are currently stationed at 20 Chinese military bases. The development of the fleet of helicopters has been long and slow, but the Chinese have come out with something impressive. Beijing's success has been dampened by the claims that it's been domestically developed and superior. This has forced experts to take it a notch down and compare them to a lot of veterans in the game. While China's Apache lookalike helicopter is not superior to a lot of more premium fighters, China's technology and development definitely place it in the top 10 attack helicopters in the world.
Stephen Su was a Chinese national who operated a small aviation company in Canada. Despite being a small company, Stephen worked tirelessly to establish connections with American and Canadian firms, which gave him an extensive network of business contacts. But someone was noticing his hard work: the FBI. The people working with Stephen had no idea that the man they were dealing with would have been involved in such a large conspiracy, because neither was he Stephen Su, nor was he just a businessman. His real name was Su Bin, and he was on a nasty mission. In 2014, a criminal complaint was filed against him in Los Angeles. In July of 2014, Su was arrested in Canada on a warrant issued in relation to this case, and was later extradited to the US in 2016, where 51-year-old Su finally admitted that he was part of a conspiracy against the US. But the shocking part was in the details, the way this conspiracy was being carried out. And when Su started spilling the beans, it shook the entire nation. As an entrepreneur, the reason he was working so hard to establish connections within Canada and American firms was not because he wanted to expand his business, but rather to assist the people he was working for, the ones operating behind the scenes. The connections Su was making weren't with random firms, but with top defense contractors in the US and Canada, who produce some of the most sophisticated weapons systems on the planet. He even drew the attention of the business community through an article in the Wall Street Journal on his business model, products, and contacts within the industry. By 2013, Su had also established connections with GE Aviation in Cincinnati, a firm well known for its advanced turbofan technologies. And just remember that name for now. I'll soon explain why it's important. Remember, we're going to expose some very powerful forces, and they might suppress this video, but you can help us prevent this by tapping on that like button below. Thank you. But the question is, why was Su so eager to establish connections with the top defense firms? This is because Su's job was to inform his co-conspirators about whom to target, which files to steal, and why the information they stole was significant. On top of that, he even translated the stolen information into Chinese, and even drafted formal reports on the material they managed to steal. He admitted that from October of 2008 to March of 2014, he conspired with 2 hackers to gain unauthorized access to protected computer networks in the United States, including the ones belonging to the Boeing Company, California, to obtain sensitive military information. He revealed that they stole 630,000 files from Boeing, which is a massive 65 gigabytes of data related to the C-17 heavy-lift cargo aircraft, using the information he had gained through his business contacts. The C-17 Globemaster is the US Air Force's primary transport aircraft. But Su and his hacker friends had their eyes set on an even bigger target, the most sophisticated fighter jets on the planet. They were now targeting Lockheed Martin's F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II, the best fighter jets produced to date. For at least 6 years, Su and his team of hackers accessed tens of thousands of files related to the stealth fighter programs. And the reason it took 6 long years for US intelligence to catch Su Bin was because he and his partners were extremely smart, and they knew how to outsmart the authorities. Su and his partners not only put in a lot of effort to steal the information, but they also worked equally hard to hide their tracks. And for this, they employed a tactic known as hop points. These are compromised or purchased networks in various third-party countries that mask the true origin of the infiltration. For example, a hacker in China might use a server in Brazil as a hop point, making it appear as though the cyber attack originated in Brazil rather than China. This tactic helped them hide their true location and hence evade detection. This is why FBI counterintelligence experts had to trace their activities through multiple nations to identify the actual source. And after a lot of hard work, he was finally caught. During the investigation, in a 2011 email presented as evidence, Su bragged to his associates that the information they had stolen from the F-22 and F-35 programs would allow us to rapidly catch up with US levels, to stand easily on the giant's shoulders. But what exactly was he referring to? And who was the mastermind behind this conspiracy? Let's address something that's been on my mind before we move forward. After watching my videos or other YouTubers' videos, I'm sure some of you guys have thought about starting your own channel. One of the biggest hurdles people face when starting a YouTube channel is that they are not comfortable showing their face in videos. Not everyone wants to give up their privacy and be in the public eye all the time. That's one of the big reasons why our videos are made in a documentary style. The craziest part is, people still love the videos, as you can see from the fact that we recently crossed 1 million subscribers. In fact, there are millions of faceless YouTube channels making content and earning ad revenue. In just the last 3 years, YouTube has paid out $70 billion to creators. That's around $60 million every single day. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, right now is the perfect time. That's why we've launched a completely free 7-day email crash course on how to start and grow a faceless YouTube channel. If that's something you're interested in, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. All right, now let's get back to the topic at hand. When I started digging deeper into similar missions, I came across a report by the American cybersecurity firm Mandiant Solutions. Since 2004, Mandiant has investigated several computer security breaches at hundreds of organizations around the world. Mandiant successfully tracked many hacker groups and even identified one that was the most active and successful. They named it APT-1. For now, just remember this name. We'll explain what it means shortly. But what surprised me was the location of the hackers. In fact, the location Mandiant traced it back to was most likely the same place where Su Bin's conspirators were operating from. The images of the building, known as Unit 61398, looked something like this. The Mandiant team even mentioned the address of the building, which was Unit 61398, Datong Road 208, Pudong New Area, Shanghai. And you know where Shanghai is. in the People's Republic of China. But the details they uncovered and who they were working for left them shocked. Because they weren't just random hackers doing it for money. They were operating in a highly organized manner. In fact, based on the size of Unit 61398's physical infrastructure, Mandiant estimated that the unit is staffed by hundreds and perhaps thousands of people. So, just to give you some context, the building you just saw is estimated to have offices for about 2,000 people. The scary part is this is only one of the unit's several buildings, and some of them are even larger. Turns out that the people in these buildings were working for a segment of the Chinese military called the People's Liberation Army General Staff Department's 3rd Department, 2nd Bureau, otherwise known as Unit 61398. Several hundreds of people who worked there were responsible for several things that included military reconnaissance, electronic warfare, and even writing propaganda comments on social media. In fact, all this was being executed in such an organized manner that there were university-recommended courses for students willing to apply for positions in Unit 61398, and even job listings for hacking roles in this unit. The former employees even included the hacking achievements in their CVs, and one hacker even published a scientific paper on his hacking techniques. As I mentioned, APT-1 wasn't the only group that was involved in hacking. There are, or at least were, more than 20 APT groups originating from China, with APT-1 being one of them. Now, this might surprise you, but these groups have played a critical role in making China a superpower. But you may ask, what exactly is APT, and how did they make China a superpower? An APT, or Advanced Persistent Threat, is a cyber attack where the attacker gains and maintains long-term, unauthorized access to a computer network without being detected. And the primary purpose of these hackers is to mine highly sensitive data. But for what?
The first public appearance of its latest stealth fighter. The Chengdu J-20 was the star of the show. China's touting the new aircraft as being undetectable by radar and a competitor to the U.S. Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor.
In March 2014, China unveiled its 5th-generation fighter aircraft, the J-20. This initially looked like just a normal event, but when pictures of the new J-20 first surfaced on the internet, they raised eyebrows among anyone with even a basic knowledge of modern defense equipment. Its looks, design, and features shocked the entire world, especially the US. Maybe some US officials even anticipated it. And if you haven't heard of the J-20, here's what it looks like. And this is what the world's most advanced fighters, the F-22 and the F-35, look like. Can you spot the difference between them? I don't think there are that many differences. They both look exactly the same. This might be a coincidence, but when so many coincidences occur and the timelines of multiple events overlap, it's hard to believe this was all just a coincidence. Don't believe me? We'll have a look. In 2008, China began developing its first stealth fighter under Project 718, with the primary goal of competing with Western jets. The development contract was awarded to Chengdu Aerospace Corporation. But surprisingly, 2008 was the same year in which Su began working with the 2 hackers employed by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Later, in 2009, 6 current and former government officials even confirmed that the Joint Strike Fighter program that produced the F-35 had been accessed multiple times by unknown hackers. They managed to secure several terabytes of information regarding the aircraft's design and systems. In fact, Pentagon officials mentioned that the hackers were so expert that they used a method that encrypted the data as they were stealing it, which made it very difficult to evaluate what exactly had been stolen. And this was just the beginning. After this espionage attack, things started taking a weird turn in 2011, when the J-20 fighter design that was under development since 2008 suddenly adopted several significant and stealthy changes. By the way, if you remember, this was the same year when Su sent that email to his Chinese contacts, mentioning that the information they stole from the F-22 and F-35 programs would allow them to rapidly catch up with the US levels and stand easily on the giant's shoulders. A year later, a fighter jet similar to that of the F-35, which China named the Shenyang J-31, took its first flight in 2012. By 2013, Su had also established connections with GE Aviation, the same company we mentioned in the beginning and I asked you to remember. Because this was the same company who was competing against Pratt & Whitney to provide its advanced engines to the F-22 and F-35 fighter jets. Although both the F-22 and F-35 are powered by Pratt & Whitney's, it's worth noting that GE's proposal for the F-22 Raptor engine was actually a more advanced and capable design than Pratt & Whitney's. It's just that Pratt & Whitney's YF-119 engine was chosen because of its simplicity and its more mature and proven technology. Finally, 2014, as we saw China's new and improved J-20 design finally emerged. This was the same year when Su Bin was caught, and he pretty much succeeded in his job. China might claim that the similarities between the J-20, Shenyang J-31, and the US F-22 and F-35 jets are just coincidences, but now you know the story behind these so-called coincidences. But something was missing. Even after so many coincidences and allegations leveled at China, the US military denied everything for a very long period of time. Until January of 2015, because this was when documents leaked by Edward Snowden became the first public confirmation that the F-35 was stolen by the Chinese. And they stole the world's most advanced fighter jet, the US-made F-35 and F-22, not by a daring maverick or by an undercover agent, but by sending a few emails to Lockheed Martin employees pretending to be their co-worker. According to sources, this data breach already took place in 2007. Another document leaked by WikiLeaks exposed details about Byzantine Hades, the name US investigators gave the attackers they traced back to China. To be more specific, traced back to a unit of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. The same report mentions about 30,000 hacking incidents, which includes 500 major breaches in Department of Defense systems, compromise of more than 600,000 user accounts, over 300,000 user ID passwords, and even records of 33,000 US Air Force officers were compromised. The total data extracted from all these hacking incidences was nearly 50 terabytes. The overall damage was estimated to be more than $100 million. Later in 2016, we saw even more public confirmations, one of which was Su Bin admitting involvement in a conspiracy. But even after so many conspiracies, the CCP could never replicate these jets or even other technologies exactly as they are. And this is because of a very simple reason. Before you understand this reason, you must know what made these technologies vulnerable to hackers. If you consider the case of the F-22 and the F-35, these aircraft weren't built or developed entirely by Lockheed Martin alone. Both of these fighters are the result of collaboration among many contractors and subcontractors, with design details shared across different companies to ensure smooth manufacturing. So it was easy to target just one of the contractors and get access to the design. However, most of the confidential systems developed for the aircraft are kept isolated from broader network access to prevent security breaches. So accessing them is almost impossible. This is why, even though their jets look very similar to US ones, they have a lot of differences in their performance parameters. And on the majority of the parameters, the original technology turns out to be far superior to the copied Chinese weapons. Anyway, this allowed the Chinese military to reverse engineer various aircraft components, which would otherwise have cost millions of dollars to develop from scratch. This approach saved not only money, but also a significant amount of time in research and development. In fact, it's not just the US that's on China's radar. China steals technology from any country that could benefit it. And I mean any country, including its closest allies. If you've seen our previous video on how China cunningly replicates weapon technology, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. But didn't I say that China became a superpower using this method? You might be wondering how stealing just military technology could have made China a superpower. While it's a crucial part of becoming a superpower, it's not the only factor, right? What you're thinking is completely right. But did I say that China was only targeting defense secrets? Absolutely not. Because whatever I mentioned about the Chinese hacking was just the tip of the iceberg. The dark secrets I discovered apart from the defense hacking is worrisome for literally every one of us. In fact, a former senior official at McAfee said the scariest line. He said, "I divide the entire set of Fortune Global 2000 firms into two categories. Those that know they've been compromised and those that don't know it yet." You will understand the depth of this line as we move forward. I mentioned earlier that everything these hackers do is in an extremely organized way. Everything is planned, communicated, and executed properly. And I mean so systematically that even the government is involved in this. In fact, there is a way you can predict what companies and sectors could be their next targets. This is by reading their 5-year plan. These plans are a series of social and economic development initiatives issued by the CCP. In fact, according to Mandiant, the industries APT-1 targeted match the industries that China has identified as strategic to their growth, including 4 of the 7 strategic emerging industries that China identified in its 12th 5-year plan. Basically, China lists everything it wants to achieve or improve in its 5-year plans. One such thing that China wanted to achieve was mentioned in their 13th 5-year plan. This plan included everything China wanted to achieve from 2016 to 2020, including the development of necessary infrastructure, factories, and systems in China to mass-produce their own large and regional passenger planes. This is because China saw a huge opportunity in the large commercial plane market. Airbus and Boeing combined control 99% of this market. So China decided to develop such planes indigenously, sell them for cheap, and capture a chunk of this market. They even made an impressive start when its state-owned aerospace company, Comac, built the first prototype in 2015. They named it Comac C919. But, as always, it came with that typical Chinese charm. And no, I'm not talking about Winnie the Pooh. I'm talking about flaws that come with every Chinese technology. Because of the delays due to design flaws, this plane took 2 long years just to complete its first maiden flight in 2017. Anyways, it was a great deal because Comac became one of the select companies that had the ability to manufacture large commercial planes, and that too, roughly at half the cost of its competitors. This aircraft seemed like a great achievement, but the reality was far different. Actually, Comac procured 60% of the C919's parts from US aerospace companies. Basically, Comac received collaboration from US companies. But sources claim that something was fishy and more than just collaboration. This is because in a 2019 report, a cybersecurity technology company, CrowdStrike, accused the Chinese government of stealing technology through spying. In fact, a Chinese intelligence officer was even trying to steal one of the most sensitive pieces of information. Actually, this was the most satisfying thing I've read. No, I'm not talking about the espionage, but rather how the spy was caught by the FBI. And trust me, it was no less thrilling than a Hollywood movie. Xu Yanjun, a Chinese intelligence officer, was trying to steal information from GE Aviation. Actually, this was one of the companies that provided engines to Airbus and Boeing aircrafts. He was trying to steal GE Aviation's exclusive composite aircraft engine fan module. This technology is so complex that no other company in the world has been able to replicate it. Xu tries to set a trap. He has his eyes set on a GE Aviation employee. In March 2017, Xu invited this person to give a talk at a Chinese university. The employee accepts and travels to China in May. Upon arrival, he meets Xu, who covers all his travel expenses. These were likely some trust-building activities. The employee delivers his presentation and returns home. But he had no idea about the real intentions of Xu. In January of 2018, Xu asked the employee for some sensitive information. And because there was already so much trust between them, the employee emailed a 2-page document from the company that was marked as confidential. Xu wanted more. So he suggested meeting the employee in Europe and asked for more company files. Surprisingly, the employee agreed and Xu traveled to Belgium in April of 2018 to meet with him. He also brought some cash for their meeting. But to his surprise, he was arrested by authorities when he arrived. He had no idea how he got exposed. In reality, Xu had no clue that the FBI had taken control of the situation long before he could even suspect it. Actually, after the employee returned from China, the FBI took over the communication, and it was the FBI who was pretending to be the employee. Every conversation Xu thought he was having with the employee was actually with the FBI. In fact, sending the confidential information via email was also part of the FBI's trap. Finally, he was extradited to the United States, where he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The prosecutors even stated that the 2 state-owned companies involved in the C919's developments received technical information from Xu. But do you know that China has a no-discrimination policy? It believes in unity in diversity. This is why it doesn't discriminate between defense industries, high-tech industries, real estate, oil and natural gas pipeline operators, government agencies, etc. It steals everything it can get, from multiple organizations, multiple countries, and almost every sector you can imagine. In fact, the Chinese hackers even targeted the International Olympic Committee and the World Anti-Doping Agency around the 2008 Beijing Olympics. A report identified 9 APT groups responsible for some of the largest hacking operations from 2006 to 2015. Not surprisingly, all of them originated from the same country, China. One of the earliest operations that shocked everyone was Operation Shady Rat, where RAT stands for Remote Access Tool. McAfee, the organization that investigated this operation, identified a command and control server used by the intruders. By monitoring the server, they tracked the activities of the hackers from 2006 to 2011, identifying numerous victim organizations. When McAfee finally published their report, it shocked the world. The hackers targeted 71 institutions across 14 different countries. The main objective of the attackers in Operation Shady Rat was to infiltrate systems, gain unauthorized access, and then maintain that access over an extended period of time. This allowed them to continuously extract sensitive data and monitor the activities of the victim organizations without detection. Yeah, you heard that right. The scariest part was the victims were not even aware that they'd been hacked, and the hackers were stealing sensitive data from their systems. The shortest time that an organization remained compromised was less than a single month, and the longest McAfee reported was about 28 months. But the scariest one was the one Mandiant reported, because even they were tracking a hacker group named APT-1 they tracked from 2006 to 2013. They found that APT-1 hacked 141 companies over 20 major industries. The most shocking part is that APT-1 managed to maintain access to one of the victims' networks for a whopping 1,764 days, or about 4 years and 10 months. I mean, can you imagine? Your computer's been hacked, and for the past 5 years, hackers have been extracting all your sensitive data without you even knowing it. Seems pretty scary, right? Once they gain access, the hackers periodically revisit the victim's network over several months or years, stealing a wide range of intellectual property, including technology blueprints, proprietary manufacturing processes, test results, business plans, pricing documents, partnership agreements, and emails and contact lists from the organization's leadership. Mandiant reported that APT-1 stole hundreds of terabytes of data from 2006 to 2013. The Mandiant report believes that the stolen information was used to benefit the PRC and Chinese state-owned enterprises. For example, in 2008, APT-1 breached the network of a company in the wholesale industry. Over the next 2.5 years, APT-1 stole an unknown number of files from the victim and repeatedly accessed the email accounts of several executives, including the CEO and general counsel. Surprisingly, during the same period, major news organizations reported that China successfully negotiated a double-digit price reduction per unit with the victim organization for one of its major commodities. While this might be purely coincidental, the timing suggests that the stolen data likely played a significant role in that negotiation. Operations like Shady Rat and similar ones proved extremely beneficial for China. They helped China acquire important trade secrets, which contributed to its rise as a major global power. But what exactly did the hackers do to break the systems? The hackers used a very simple method to hack into systems, something even you might have experienced. The hackers pose as a coworker and send an email with a malicious link or attachment to the person they are targeting. If the attachment is opened, it installs malicious software into the system. The hackers then take control of the infected computer and steal the important data they were targeting. In the earlier years, the Chinese hackers didn't worry about being tracked and didn't take much effort to hide their origin. As a result, it was easier to trace them back to their origin. But as the years passed, the hackers became more careful and made more efforts to make sure that they weren't traced back easily. Even the motive of the attacks changed with time. Initially, the hackers aimed to target as many victims as possible and steal as much information as they could. Over time, their goal shifted to maintaining access for as long as possible, ensuring they could retrieve information whenever needed. Lastly, just remember to verify any link or attachment you click on. Who knows? You might be the next target. December 29th, 2023. Xi Jinping fired 9 of his very senior military officials, and Beijing did not explain the reason behind this. The world never knew why he did that. until a media company exposed the truth. A truth that shattered Xi Jinping's dream of making China a military superpower by 2050, revealing a problem so vast that it exposed the hollowness of the world's third largest military power. Imagine China going to war with some country. Xi Jinping orders his commanders to fire ballistic missiles at the enemy. But, to everyone's surprise, the missiles fail to leave the launch pad because they contain not fuel, but water. I know this sounds crazy, and it is, but this is what was uncovered. This news took the world by storm, and according to reports, this hole in the Chinese army's readiness is due to widespread corruption. According to the media, Xi Jinping dismissed 9 senior officials for this same reason: systemic corruption.
A slew of examples of the impact of corruption in the country. And this includes missiles being filled with water instead of fuel.
Out of the 9 officials suspended, 1 belonged to the Air Force and 1 to the Navy. 2 of the others served in the Central Military Commission, or CMC. The largest part of the suspensions impacted the Rocket Force, the agency that reportedly saw the most severe corruption. 5 out of the top 9 generals fired belonged to the Rocket Force, the PLA's tactical and nuclear missiles arm. This has raised several questions on the capabilities of the PLA and the huge military figures it brags about, leaving open the question on whether China is really as powerful as it shows to the world. The world has witnessed multiple troubling cases, such as Pakistan suffering humiliation because of China's faulty defense systems, or of PLA soldiers fleeing the battleground, or its top officials allegedly reluctant to fight a war. The list goes on and on. In fact, the situation is so bad that junior-level officers in China get promoted not on the basis of their performance, but by bribing their seniors in the majority of cases. But one of the greatest military generals, Sun Tzu, once said, "There is no greater danger than underestimating your opponent." There's a very good reason why I'm saying this. In fact, an ex-MIT professor mentioned that this could be China's genius strategy to fool its rivals. And to be fair, his statement could be plausible. China's shipbuilding capacity is 232 times that of the US, representing almost 50% of the total global shipbuilding capacity, which also supports a massive expansion of its navy. They are having a rapid nuclear weapons buildup, and their presence and strength in the South China Sea is rapidly increasing. So, before we get too cozy with the fact that China is a very hollow force, let's discuss 1. What recent event could possibly be one of China's biggest moves to fool the world? 2. What is China hiding from the world? And 3. What past events have blown the cover of China's claim of being a superpower? Alright, let's start the video. On January 6, 2024, just 8 days after the dismissal of the 9 Chinese military officials, Bloomberg reported that the corruption in the PLA had reached such levels that the Chinese missiles are being filled with water instead of fuel. Now take a look at this. What you're seeing is a missile silo. In the second part of the picture, as you can see, a ballistic missile is kept inside the huge structure. In the first part, it shows the lid of the silo. Now, the reason why such huge structures are built for missiles is to protect them against enemy attacks. These missiles are connected to an underground launch control center through a system of hardened cables. So these silos play a critical role in protecting these missiles, as well as centralizing its control system. Now imagine the missile silos with defective lids. Will it work when required? No, right? But according to the Bloomberg report, even these silos have become the victims of corruption in China. And if you're thinking this is just 1 or 2 missiles, yeah, think again. Because according to the report, large missile silo fields in western China are equipped with malfunctioning lids. So now the question arises, if the Chinese missiles are filled with water, their lids are defective, and these missiles cannot be used when required, then why did I say that this could be China's greatest move to fool its rivals? This is because this could be China's Potemkin arsenal, much like the fake villages used by old Russia to project an air of prosperity. This fake missile arsenal was set up only for the purpose of propaganda and to fool the world. But why is China building a fake missile arsenal? And how can these fake missiles be potentially used to fool the world? Because the more it would fake, the more it could make. Ah, fake and make. The rhyming words just sound so great. Anyways, according to reports from researchers associated with the Federation of American Scientists, or FAS, in the past 5 years, China has significantly expanded its ongoing nuclear modernization program by deploying greater numbers of nuclear weapons than ever before. This includes the construction of 3 new missile silo fields for solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missiles and expanded construction of silos for liquid-fuel ICBMs. According to researchers, the People's Republic of China's stockpile stands at 500 nuclear warheads, which is just behind Russia and the USA. But this isn't the end. You've yet to hear the most shocking fact. According to the 2024 report published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, China's nuclear expansion is among the largest and most rapid modernization campaigns of the 9 nuclear-armed states. In fact, in 2023, the US Defense Department reported that China would more than double its operational nuclear stockpile to 1,000-plus weapons by 2030. China's rapid expansion of its nuclear arsenal has raised questions about its long-standing no-first-use policy for nuclear weapons, and whether it would really be able to abide by this policy or not. But this is where the US identified the risk that China may pose to it and its allies. So, the US proposed to discuss strategic risk reduction strategies with China. The US has been doing this since 2018, but China declined to sit down for a discussion. The US did this again the next year, and China again declined it. China continued to refuse until 2023. After 5 years of rejecting US requests to discuss strategic risk reduction, Beijing finally resumed nuclear arms talks with the US in 2023. Even with these new talks, they haven't agreed to talk formally about controlling these weapons. These dialogues could pressure China and could hopefully lead to a pause in China's nuclear expansion. Guess what? You shouldn't be surprised if China agrees to destroy some of its nuclear weapons under this pressure. So for the world, the Chinese would have done a fantastic job by halting the arms race. But only the Chinese would know what they've destroyed. Not real missiles, but fake ones. Remember I mentioned an ex-MIT professor? His name is Vipin Narang, and he's currently the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy under the Biden administration. And regarding the recent case of Chinese missiles with water and defective lids, he said, and I quote, "Just because you build the silos doesn't mean you have to fill them all with missiles. This means that even if the lids are defective, it doesn't matter because it may not even contain a functional missile inside of it." Now, this also means that China would have deliberately done this to save its real nuclear missiles from an enemy attack, because the chances would then be high that the enemy would have destroyed just the empty silos, yet believe in the illusion that they destroyed the real ones. Later, Narang mentioned that China could use them as a bargaining chip for future arms control negotiations with the United States. So basically, China would say, "Hey, I'll destroy 50 nukes from my side if you'll follow and do the same." Or in the second scenario, it would just agree to destroy its own nukes because of global pressure. But in reality, China would just destroy the dummy missiles and would still maintain the same number of operational nukes. Another argument from the former U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Stephen Bryan, mentioned that China purposely didn't keep its liquid-fueled rockets filled with fuel because the internal tanks and plumbing of the rocket booster would have been ruined by corrosion. So the military fuels them only when critical conditions arrive. This is because it takes only 30 to 60 minutes to fuel a DF-5 or Dongfeng missile. This is the same variant that China was recently building silos for. However, when it comes to filling the missiles with water, he said that there would be no reason to put water in the missiles unless it was, like, a sabotage. And if all this was done, the officers would have been arrested, tried, shot, or subjected to the harshest measure, and Xi Jinping would have not just dismissed them. This is because sabotage or destruction of strategic nuclear missiles is a very serious crime. For the faulty lids of the silos, Stephen said that there were no missiles inside, so it doesn't matter if the lids were perfectly operational at the time. So if water in the missiles and faulty lids aren't the reasons for the dismissals of the military officials, then why would Xi Jinping have dismissed them? For this, Stephen Bryan mentioned something so shocking that it literally exposed Xi Jinping's dirty power game behind the dismissals of military officials. Xi Jinping uses corruption probes to eliminate his competitors and anyone he thinks is a threat to his leadership. Stephen also said that most people believe that the dismissal of the officers was because of corruption. But this is hard to believe since they were not put on trial and were instead just directly dismissed. Putting them on trial wouldn't have made any sense anyways, because Xi Jinping may not have had any direct evidence against them. But now, this raises a critical question. What exactly is the reality? According to US intelligence, as reported by Bloomberg, China could be a paper tiger, but other US officials believe China is still a military superpower. So you might ask, how do we come to a conclusion then? Well, I have a very simple yet very effective way to predict whether China is really a superpower or not. My history teacher once said, if you want to understand the future, go back and study the past, because history always repeats itself. What we have seen till now was about weapons that don't have a very solid history. These weapons aren't battle-tested, and we don't have any solid proof on the results when these weapons were tested. So now, let's deep dive into some of the past events to understand the history and performance of the Chinese weapons, PLA soldiers, and Xi Jinping's dirty tactics against his own military officers. Remember, this doesn't just include the incidents from China, but countries all across the globe where either Chinese soldiers or their weapons were deployed. So this time, there's no question of whether the incident really happened or not, or whether some assumptions were taken regarding it. Whatever happened was in front of the world, so there's no chance of hiding it from the world. Let's begin with the Chinese military hardware. One of the best examples the world witnessed was something that brought about global embarrassment to Pakistan. On the 26th of February, 2019, at 12:06 a.m. on a cold night, a Pakistani Twitter account tweeted, "Sleep tight because PAF is awake. Hashtag Pakistan Zindabad." Just 3.5 hours later, something very unexpected happened that shook Pakistan from head to toe. But why were the Pakistanis so confident? And why did they tweet specifically about their Air Force? The story begins with a terror strike in India.
Terrorists from the Jaish-e-Mohammed have carried out a major attack in the Pulwama district. A car laden with more than 100 kilograms of explosives rammed into the CRPF bus, killing 40 personnel in an instant.
On February 14th, 2019, a terror attack was carried out in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir by a suicide bomber, resulting in the death of 40 paramilitary soldiers. This attack was claimed by Jaish-e-Mohammed, a terrorist organization headquartered in Pakistan. India decided to avenge this attack by destroying the terrorist launch pads in Pakistan. Pakistan anticipated a response from India, especially its Air Force. It should have been the Pakistan Air Force who would have responded to them, which is why the tweet mentioned the Pakistan Air Force. This is where China comes into the picture. It turns out that the air defense system Pakistan was using was made in China. So these jets must have protected Pakistan from Indian fighter jets, right? The basic job of an air defense system is to detect any unidentified aircraft at the country's border, alert the country's defense, and shoot down the hostile aircraft. Surprisingly, the Chinese air defense system was not even able to respond in a reasonable time. This made the job slightly easier for the Indian pilots, who struck terrorist launch pads on the 26th of February 2019 at around 3:30 a.m. and eliminated an estimated 300 to 350 terrorists in the Balakot region of Pakistan. In fact, this isn't the only case where the Chinese air defense system proved to be a failure. There have been multiple such instances, like the missile and drone strikes by Iran into Pakistan in January of 2024, or the USA's strike into Pakistan to eliminate Osama bin Laden, wherein neither the entry nor the exit of the 4 helicopters from Afghanistan was detected by the Pakistani air defense system. In all these cases, the majority of the Pakistani air defense systems were of Chinese origin. And this isn't just with air defense systems. Pakistan's military hasn't had a good experience with many other pieces of Chinese military hardware they've procured. This includes Chinese equipment inducted in the past few years. which are facing a lot of servicing and performance issues with everything from battle tanks to artillery. But if you think Pakistan is the only victim of made-in-China weapons, then you must know what's happening with other countries using these weapons. In fact, the Chinese have a history of manufacturing and using inferior military hardware. One of the latest examples is the JF-17 jets supplied to Myanmar. For context, these jets are jointly produced by the Pakistan Aeronautical Complex and China's Chengdu Aircraft Industries Corporation. Myanmar showed interest in buying these jets, and they signed a deal in 2016. And the jets were supplied by Pakistan between 2019 and 2021. But guess what? It wasn't even a year after the jets were introduced to the Myanmar Air Force that they began to experience failures. The Myanmar Air Force had to soon ground the aircraft due to many malfunctions and structural flaws that were detected in the jets. Similar was the case of the JF-17 fleet acquired in 2022. And as of 2023, all 11 of Myanmar's JF-17 planes were reported as not operational due to technical glitches. This is the reason why Pakistan has been struggling to sell similar aircraft to other countries, especially Latin American nations. On the other hand, Nigeria, which already has 3 JF-17s, refused to buy more of them, and instead chose Italian fighter aircraft, which they're set to receive by the end of 2024. Speculations say it's because of the Myanmar case. Even Argentina was once interested in JF-17s, but now they've decided to mostly buy from either the US or India. So the JF-17 has multiple issues, ranging from engine problems to aircraft refueling and its weapon systems. Well, guess what? This is the same JF-17 which China brags about, yet doesn't even have a single JF-17 in its air force. In fact, the same China, which supplies many types of defense equipment to the world, itself considered buying 24 Su-35 fighters and 4 Lada-class submarines from Russia. Maybe because China is too confident in its capabilities? Too confident that the Chinese weapons will surely cause problems? When it comes to one of its other closest defense partners, Bangladesh, it has supplied the FM-90 short-range air defense system for 3 million renminbi in 2011. But just 3 years later, defects began to appear in the air defense system, affecting its performance. Other cases include defects in the 2 Ming-class submarines, which cost Bangladesh $200 million. Because of these equipment issues, the Bangladesh government and the Navy are now burdened with the cost of repairs, import duties, and various other issues. Iraq, on the other hand, bought Chinese drones, but 8 of the 20 CH-4B drones crashed within the first few years of operation. These drones were so inferior that Algeria lost 3 CH-4Bs within just a few months. This is the reason other Chinese drone users like Morocco, Nigeria, and Turkmenistan have switched to Turkish drones. Likewise, Indonesia bought C-705 anti-ship missiles from China, but they failed to hit the targets. Not just once, but over and over again. China sold F-22P frigates to its darling Pakistan, but the ship's surface-to-air missiles proved ineffective. Their infrared seekers were discarded because they couldn't lock onto their targets. The frigate showed poor performance, and its engines were degraded. When Pakistan asked China to rectify these frigate problems, China refused, forcing Pakistan to turn to Turkey to upgrade them. These and many other such incidents have proved the inferiority of the Chinese weapons again and again. But this begs the question, with so many cases of failure of Chinese weapons, why are countries still buying these weapons? And most importantly, what is the fundamental problem with Chinese weapons? First of all, there are 3 major reasons countries use Chinese weapons. Number 1, Chinese weapons are cheaper as compared to their counterparts. This is why most of the countries you see buying Chinese weapons are either underdeveloped or developing countries. Just for context, America's F-35 Lightning II and China's Shenyang FC-31 are both aircraft carrier-based naval fighter jets. But while the US jet costs up to $109 million per aircraft, the Chinese version is 36% cheaper at around $70 million. Number 2, China's systems are offered with enticements such as donations and flexible payment options. For example, China gifted 50 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium to Pakistan in mid-1982 to counter India. On the other hand, when it comes to buying ammunition, countries often require payments in US dollars. But in the case of China, it exported multiple weapons to Venezuela and agreed that Venezuela can use oil for partial payment. Similarly, China's exports of armored vehicles to Thailand are financed with dried foodstuffs. The Chinese FD-2000 long-range air defense missile systems were exported to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan in exchange for natural gas. And number 3, geopolitics and diplomacy also play an important role. Countries like Pakistan and even Bangladesh, to some extent, buy such weapons to maintain good relations with China. On the other hand, the Assistant Secretary of State in the US, Mr. Clark Cooper, states that China even uses bribes to sell its weapons. And if you've seen our video on ports, then you already know how China uses bribes to win projects. He even goes further by saying that China is using arms transfers as a means of getting its foot in the door. A door that, once opened, China quickly exploits, both to exert influence and to gather intelligence. These are the reasons why China is such a popular option for developing and underdeveloped countries when it comes to buying weapons. This is the reason why China is the world's 4th largest arms exporter, just behind the US, France, and Russia, accounting for 5.8% of international arms sales from 2019 to 2023. But there's something these numbers aren't telling you. The countries which once bought large quantities of weapons from China are now hesitating to buy from their Asian partner. We have examples of China's previous customers like Algeria, Egypt, Iran, Sri Lanka, and Turkey, who are now either not buying from China or they have decreased their quantities significantly while preferring other suppliers. In fact, in the last 20 years, more than 60% of the Chinese arms exports went to just 3 countries: Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. Even out of these 3 countries, the data from 2013 to 2023 shows that Pakistan alone accounted for 45% of the value of China's arms exports. But the overall numbers say that Chinese arms exports are falling. According to a report by Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China, which once had a 6.3% share of global arms exports from 2013 to 2017, decreased to 5.2% in 2018 to 2022, a 23% drop in its global share. So this begs the question, what is the fundamental problem with these Chinese weapons? The answer lies in how the Chinese weapons are actually designed and manufactured. Have a look at these pictures. The first pic is of a Russian Sukhoi Su-33, and the second one is a Chinese Shenyang J-15 Flying Shark. Have a look at the next 2 pictures. The first one is a US-made Lockheed Martin F-35B Lightning II, and the next one is a Chinese-made Shenyang J-31. Did you spot what's wrong with these pictures? The Chinese literally copied the weapons from these countries and then made their own. You might say, come on, can't some weapons look the same? How can you say China has copied it from other countries? As you've seen in the first picture, the Russian Sukhoi Su-33 officially entered service in August of 1998, whereas the Chinese Shenyang J-15 Flying Shark was introduced in 2013. Similarly, the US-made Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II was first rolled out in 2006. But its Chinese copy, the Shenyang J-31's prototype, performed its maiden flight in 2012. If we compare the specifications of Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II and Shenyang J-31, they're almost the same. Their length, height, and wingspan are almost the same. Both are single-seater fighter jets. But if we compare them on the performance parameters, you'll notice a big difference. The maximum takeoff weight for the F-35 is around 32,000 kilograms, whereas for the Shenyang, it's around 25,000 kilograms. The F-35 has a payload capacity of 8,160 kilograms, but for Shenyang, it's 2,268 kilograms. The combat range of the F-35 is 770 miles, and for the Shenyang, it's 750. The only advantage Shenyang has is its speed of 2,200 kilometers an hour, which it gets from the combined power of its twin engines, compared to the single engine of the F-35 with a speed of 1,931 kilometers per hour. So this is just a single example of the similarities between the real weapon and its Chinese copy. Even when I examined other such examples, I found this similar pattern, where the original weapons are far superior than its Chinese duplicate on most of the parameters. So China just waits for the best tech to get developed, and then it copies it from the countries who developed them. China has done the same with drones, air defense systems, transport aircrafts, unmanned combat air vehicles, defense vehicles, rocket launchers, tanks, anti-tank missiles, and even with something as basic as just assault rifles. Now, if you're still not satisfied with this answer and say that just because China developed something late doesn't mean they've copied it, well, your doubts will get wiped away once you understand how China executes its strategies to copy technology. China has been using two strategies to copy-paste these weapons. Number one, cyber attacks and cyber spying. China copies the blueprints of weapons from countries like the US by conducting cyber attacks. America's cutting-edge Lockheed Martin F-35 Joint Strike Fighter and Northrop Grumman X-47B unmanned combat air vehicle look so similar that almost no one could even differentiate between them. Unless it's time to operate them on a mission, of course. But US defense officials claim that some of these technologies used in these designs was stolen through a Chinese cyber spying campaign. They also claim that Chinese military hackers have succeeded in stealing highly classified technical documents on a number of occasions. The US weapon secrets accessed by the Chinese are used in the newest versions of many Chinese weapons. You might think that accessing every piece of information is not possible. But nothing is impossible for China when it comes to stealing. US officials suspect that China goes one step further and makes secret agreements with US allies that bought these American weapons to obtain valuable technical information and advances they made. This is the reason why the US decided not to export the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor stealth fighter. If you guys haven't heard about the F-22 Raptor, it is considered the world's most advanced stealth fighter jet. In fact, in 1998, the US Congress decided to protect its stealth technology and made a law specifically prohibiting the sale of the F-22 to any other country. Still, the US military and industry officials have expressed concerns that the pace at which China is stealing technology by cyber espionage will allow China to rapidly improve their arsenal and potentially produce aircraft that will match every aspect of USA fifth-generation fighters like the F-22 and the F-35. This is a headache for the US. Now, if you think what China did to the US was bad, then you need to rethink. The worst is still to come. Because what China did to Russia will blow your mind. This is where the second strategy of China comes in. Number 2, reverse engineering. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia was in need of money. They started selling their state-of-the-art Sukhoi Su-27 fighter jets on the export market. So China bought 24 of the fighters. Later, in 1995, the Chinese showed great interest in buying the license to assemble Su-27 kits in China. Russia agreed, and China started manufacturing them. But out of nowhere, China came up with their indigenously made J-11 fighter jet in 1998, which was an exact copy of the Russian Su-27 fighter. Irony struck in 2004 when, after assembling 100 aircraft, the Chinese suddenly canceled the remainder of the contract, claiming the Su-27 no longer met their needs. It is alleged that China reverse-engineered the aircraft technology. Although China claimed that they produced the J-11 jets without any Russian involvement, their actions do no justice to their words. In another instance, China attempted to buy 2 Su-33s, which is a naval variant from the Su-27 from Russia, for $100 million in 2006. But Russia refused. But China, being China, they instead relied on a prototype purchased from Ukraine in 2001. In 2009, China made its first J-15, which is an exact copy of the Russian Su-33, with 24 of the jets serving the Chinese Navy as of 2016. In fact, China is so cunning that China used to request from Russia single samples of their most advanced systems on a trial basis. They would then allegedly reverse engineer the technology and return it back to Russia, then later produce their own versions of the weapon. Russia soon understood exactly what was happening and started rejecting such Chinese requests. To make matters worse, China even started exporting the copied weapons in the international market at cheaper rates. China has done this with every weapon and every country it can. In 2021, Pakistan commissioned the HQ-9 long-range surface-to-air missile system to shoot down aircraft and cruise missiles. This system was provided to Pakistan from none other than China. As usual, China copied the technology, but this time not from the US or Russia, but from France. In 1978 to 1979, China imported some of the French-origin Territorial surface-to-air missile systems for evaluation and secretly reverse engineer them to produce its first clone for testing in 1983. Now, if you analyze the root cause behind the inferior quality of the Chinese weapons, you must understand that it's the method that China uses to produce such weapons, because the copied version doesn't possess the quality and capabilities of the original version. On the other hand, a US naval analyst mentioned that the Chinese weapons remain untested in combat. And you must remember that it's not always about weapons. Imagine every Chinese weapon getting replaced by the world's best available alternative. So, according to our assumption, China would have the best weapons with high-end technology, equipped with the most lethal ammunition with no glitches. This would be the dream of China, and a perfect recipe for China to become a military superpower, because it already has the largest number of military personnel, and our assumption about weapons have filled the critical gap, right? Even if a country has the best weapons, it cannot win a war if the soldiers are not made for the war. Yes, you get what I mean to say. Being a soldier is not an ordinary job. For this, you must have the desire to sacrifice your life for your country, and this is only possible if the person is passionate for it. No one can be forced to become a soldier. But if they were forced, this is what that would look like.
Chinese peacekeepers had abandoned their posts in South Sudan in July instead of protecting civilians after coming under attack.
On the 11th of July 2016, the Chinese UN peacekeepers were operating in South Sudan's capital, Juba. Their primary goal was to maintain peace in the region and protect civilians. But a US report said that the Chinese soldiers abandoned their posts, weapons, and ammunition entirely after coming under attack from the local militia. China obviously denied such allegations, but then the UN itself came into the picture. One of their reports confirmed that Chinese peacekeepers actually abandoned their posts. This mission was on completely different terrain and far from their homeland. The Chinese are too strong when they are in their own country, or at least very close to it. Let's see some of their brave actions. China's love for intruding and illegally occupying their neighbors' regions near border areas is not a new thing. It has been doing it with almost all of its neighbors, one of which is India. There are multiple incidents where the Chinese soldiers illegally enter Indian border regions, claim it as theirs, and when intercepted by the Indian soldiers, they blame the Indian soldiers for entering Chinese territory instead. The Chinese then return to their territory only after strong resistance by the Indian forces. In fact, this has become a routine for the Chinese soldiers for every border region, whether it is Ladakh, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, Sikkim, or China's love, Arunachal Pradesh. But sometimes the situations get a lot worse. On the 9th of December 2022, in the Yangtze area, a border region of India's Arunachal Pradesh, 200 brave Chinese military personnel, armed with spiked clubs with nails on them, monkey fists, and taser guns, clashed with 50 Indian soldiers who were unprepared for this surprise attack. The 50 Indian soldiers not only engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat with the Chinese, but managed to overwhelm the Chinese despite their being outnumbered 4-1. In fact, they caused so much fear that they drove away the Chinese within 30 minutes. Despite full preparation, it was the Chinese who suffered the most injuries. Finally, the brave Chinese soldiers decided to return to their territory after getting beaten up by the Indian troops. I hope you get what I mean to say. Jokes apart, if you're curious to know why they were fighting with sticks and nails and not with guns, I mean, both countries literally have nuclear weapons. But the reason guns were not used is because of an agreement signed between India and China in 1996, that no side shall use firearms during face-offs. This is the reason why China gets creative on the Indian borders. This can even be linked to the case of the suspension of the 9 Chinese officers. Experts believe that it was because of corruption. Many say that it was to eliminate Xi's competition. But according to military expert Mr. Gordon Chang, the underlying reason is Xi Jinping's desire to eliminate officers hesitant about going to war. He gave an example of a Chinese Air Force general who advised not to attack Taiwan, and for this received a suspended death sentence in February of 2022. There are already such cases which show that the PLA officers are not ready for war. This shows how much love and respect Chinese soldiers receive. I mean, a death sentence just for wanting to avoid war? This is just the beginning, because China has been accused of even worse things. A Chinese journalist currently residing in the US claims the PLA will explode its own soldiers with smart sensor bracelets if they surrender to the Indian army. Now, when it comes to a winning combat strategy, experience plays a very important role. This is what the PLA lacks. The last battle China fought was in 1979 against Vietnam. It has been more than 40 years since, and the current crop of Chinese soldiers have no real combat experience. Even the senior officials who were present at the time and are experienced in warfare have already retired or are going to retire soon. So technically, the vast majority of the Chinese military is without any real combat experience. There are even examples of Chinese soldiers lacking experience and morale. One of the examples humiliated the Chinese Navy. In January of 2018, a Chinese submarine was traveling undersea in China and Japan's common zone of Japan's Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. This submarine was quickly detected by the Japanese self-defense forces. The Chinese feared their vessel could be attacked, so they quickly surfaced and unhesitatingly raised the Chinese flag in such a way which seemed like a surrender in front of the Japanese. Many Japanese and US officials believe the incident represented low morale of Chinese troops. In fact, one of the PLA's military doctrines even says that, in the initial battle of war, launch a large number of missiles and then immediately leave the front line. The Chinese Air Force also has a similar story. A report by the RAND organization says that PLA Air Force pilots are still learning how to quickly adjust to changing battlefield situations and make decisions on their own. This is because many PLAAF pilots heavily relied on their commanders in the control tower. But in actual combat scenarios, the pilot needs to make the majority of the decisions themselves. The research also shows that some PLAAF pilots struggle to accurately hit ground targets when there is a change in flight trajectories or plan. Additionally, some pilots are hesitant to take risks because they are afraid of making mistakes or are concerned about safety. China obviously is aware of these weaknesses and is taking steps to rectify it. But still, it takes decades for pilots to gain expertise in combat skills. The reason behind the low morale and confidence could be traced down to a huge blunder in 1980. In 1980, the one-child policy was implemented in China. But you may ask, well, how is that a blunder? Imagine you were the only child in your family. Wouldn't your parents pamper you? This is the case with Chinese parents. Even Chinese culture says that children must respect and take good care of their parents. This is why Chinese parents are particularly reluctant to see their child die early, especially the ones with a single child. According to a military expert, over 70% of Chinese soldiers are the only children of their parents. Although the one-child policy ended in 2016, the damage has long since been done. Now, the real reason why Chinese youths were joining the PLA is because they were forced to do it. It is mandatory for every youth to spend 2 years in military service, irrespective of whether they like it or not. In fact, according to reports, about 35% of youth in the Chinese army are forced to become soldiers. These unwilling soldiers have no way to escape from the Chinese military. If all the person wants is to leave, then the punishment they have to face are the harshest of punishments. Number 1, for 2 years the person cannot go abroad. They cannot buy land. They cannot travel on flights. They cannot travel long-distance trains or buses. They can neither get a loan nor get any insurance services. The second punishment is that the person who refuses military service cannot get a government job their whole life. Number 3, such a person is never given the chance to join the army again in their lifetime. Number 4, the person is banned from going to college for 2 years. Number 5, that person has to pay back the expenditure on whatever military training they've received besides paying a fine. This costs around $8,000. And number 6, lastly, that person is also not allowed to do business for at least 2 years. The person is also subject to public shaming. This is why military service is not at all lucrative for Chinese youth. Those who serve choose another way to make money. And I mean a lot of money. Corruption is a burning issue in the PLA. there are thousands of cases of corruption in the Chinese military. One such officer was caught with over 600 million yuan, or about $98 million. This included 60 houses, 400 kilograms of gold jewelry, and expensive artworks. He was charged with bribery, misuse of state funds, and abuse of power. He was also accused of literally selling hundreds of military posts. For example, if a senior colonel wants to become a major general, he has to pay up to 30 million yuan. Lower-ranking military positions were sold for hundreds of thousands of yuan. And the Chinese military isn't a great place for someone, even if the person is performing their duties honestly. This is simply because they're cut off from the digital world. China has banned its military from using social networking and matchmaking websites to prevent the leak of sensitive information. On top of that, these soldiers are not allowed to use the internet even outside the army without permission. They cannot open blogs on the internet. They're banned from using the internet to make friends, and from watching or listening to political programs from overseas media. Matters become even worse because the soldiers who are about to retire from the army cannot even post their resumes online for job hunting. We know all this information because it is publicly available. But there are many shocking instances that have literally busted the truth of the on-ground situation in China. Now, with China being a totalitarian state, they obviously don't just let this information escape from China, but there are cases where Chinese soldiers have fled China in search of a better life. These soldiers migrate to other countries, and many of them often reveal the ongoing situation in the Chinese military. One such soldier was Lieutenant Colonel Yao Chang, a former officer of the Chinese PLA Air Force Command who fled to the United States in 2016. He said that corruption is a very common thing throughout the Chinese military, and the reason behind the corruption is often a lack of adequate supplies or even equipment. For this, he gave an example of how he and his colleagues used to cook their food when he was serving in the Chinese military. He said that they used to drain fuel from aircraft fuel tanks for cooking, and would even take the solid fuel out of the missiles piece by piece for cooking hot pot. These things were done just because there were insufficient supplies for them to cook. Pointing to the latest dismissal of the officers on charge of corruption, Chang also said that the budget for dinners and gifts is taken from the equipment department. Basically, he's pointing out that the funds meant for buying equipment were often used by the senior officials on expensive gifts and dinners. He also mentioned that some military departments don't even have money, and if they need money, their chief has to allocate some from the equipment budget. But the money they used to get from the equipment budget would have been sufficient, only if these funds were not stolen by the corrupt officials. In a similar case, another person familiar with the Chinese military who remained anonymous out of fear said that the corruption in the military is far worse than in local government. Although he was unable to verify Bloomberg's report on the 9 dismissals, he confirmed that corruption is an extremely common thing in the Chinese military. So, widespread corruption, lack of enthusiasm, and the Chinese policies towards these are the major reason why China's youth are not interested in joining the military. Also, suspending 9 officers was really not that big of a deal for China. China has a history of these dismissals. Either the officers are really corrupt, or Xi Jinping does it to eliminate his potential competitors. This isn't even new. Since coming to power in 2012, Xi Jinping has launched an extensive anti-corruption campaign targeting the Communist Party and the government officials, with the PLA being his primary target. In fact, prior to the suspension of the 9 officers, there were many similar cases of dismissals. For instance, the sudden dismissal of Defense Minister Li Shangfu in October of 2023. Surprisingly, a position as critical as Defense Minister was left vacant for several months. Finally, China filled the vacant position with Deng Zhen as the new defense minister. Similarly, in July of 2023, Xi Jinping fired 2 officers from the rocket force. So if you think what he did with the 9 officers was something new, it really wasn't. It was just that the news got global coverage. In fact, this isn't even close to the end. An expert from Singapore, Alfred Wu, said that more heads will roll, which simply means that many other officers will soon lose their positions, either because they were really involved in corruption, or Mr. Xi Jinping sees them as a threat and wants to sideline them. The worst part is the situation of the Chinese military from the inside. The same youth who were fed up from joining the military are now also fed up with the civilian life they're living in China, forming the basis for a mutiny in China. This is so much worse that Xi Jinping himself requested they stop it and get back to work. The chances of another pandemic coming are low, but that doesn't mean that YouTube is not growing. In fact, YouTube just overtook Netflix in terms of how much time people spent on their TVs. And that's just television. Imagine how much time people are watching YouTube if you combine TV, phones, and computers. If you're waiting on a sign to start a channel, well, this may be the perfect one. And if you are looking to learn how people grow on YouTube in 2024, like this guy who got millions of views in just 2 months after starting, then I have the solution for you. We are opening up the waitlist for our first ever YouTube Basic Academy cohort. Here, we not only share the secrets we have learned about uploading for years on YouTube, we also share how we're able to start channels in completely different niches and scale them to millions of views in just a few months. We will also have live Q&As, a community where everyone can interact and learn from each other, and much more. If you want information on the cohort, then just click on the link in the description or scan the QR code that's on the screen right now. You can also sign up for the waitlist there. For the longest time, China has been known as the world's factory. I mean, take a look at the clothes you're wearing right now, the gadgets you have in your hand, and even the property in your house. Odds are, you will find that a good many things in your possession have been either entirely manufactured in China or at some stage underwent a manufacturing process in China. This could range from your jeans, your shirt, your smartphone, or even your car, whatever it might be. The point is, it's hard to talk about global manufacturing without talking about China. Or at least it was.
China's manufacturing concerns.
China's manufacturing activity fell unexpectedly.
Investors are now wary of investing in China.
Demand for Chinese manufacturing reportedly dropped 40%.
The very catalyst that shot China to its wealth and fame, being the world factory, is eroding beneath its feet. Due to several factors, China is losing its place as the world's manufacturing hub, as it undergoes a crisis that could threaten its very GDP and even its standing in the world. Today, that is what we will talk about in depth. And in case you thought this was something limited to just your jeans and your silk shirts, you are wrong. China's manufacturing crisis has the potential to change the global dynamics of power forever. This is no exaggeration. This is a fact. Follow through with me, and I promise this will be one insightful ride. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty of China's manufacturing crisis, please take a second to hit that like button. One video I forgot to ask for a like, and that video was throttled by the algorithm. So that proves that your likes really do make a huge difference in the success of these videos. Thank you. So long as most people remember, China has been a manufacturing juggernaut. In fact, China is responsible for nearly 30% of all the manufacturing that is done on a global scale. Yeah, you heard that right. One country is responsible for 30% of the manufacturing process that happens here on planet Earth. Don't take my word for it. Take it straight from the World Economic Forum. You see, according to data published by the United Nations Statistics Division, China accounted for 28% of global manufacturing output in 2018. That puts the country more than 10 percentage points ahead of the United States, which used to have the world's largest manufacturing sector until China overtook it in 2010. When China stepped up, unfaltering during an age of its great boom, it simply took the button and hit the ground running. As more factories were built, manufacturing started to contribute more and more to China's GDP. By 2018, with the total value added by the Chinese manufacturing sector amounting to almost $4 trillion, manufacturing as a sector now accounted for nearly 30% of China's GDP. To see how huge this figure is, all you need to do is compare it to the United States, where manufacturing contributed to just 11% of the nation's GDP. It's a big difference, isn't it? In all fairness, a part of why that is so is because a lot of US manufacturing work was delegated to China. It's not just the US. Several nations let China take care of their manufacturing, with multiple big companies setting up shop in China. But why is that so? Why China and not their own home nations? Well, several factors contributed to China's rise in manufacturing grace. I must mention them now as I'll be breaking them down in just a bit very soon. The factors that really catapulted China to a place of advantage were basically low labor costs, strong business ecosystems, a lack of regulatory compliance, low taxes and duties, and competitive currency practices. Combined, China had the perfect melting pot, or should I say a factory, that was unbeatable on a global scale. Countries like the US stopped investing so much in their own manufacturing industries, and they found it cheaper to just let China do the manufacturing. Although this led to the rise of manufacturing in China, it did accelerate the collapse of several local industries and the closure of factories in said countries. I will perhaps explore this more in depth in another video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see a video about that. Okay, so now we've established that China was the undisputed manufacturing hub of the world, and we have established the factors that led to that. Let's now talk about how they got into this crisis. Just before we get into that juicy bit, I want to touch on how China, using its manufacturing prowess, changed the geopolitical landscape. Understanding how China leveraged its position on the global stage will make you better understand what this devastating manufacturing crisis means for the communist nation. There really is more on the line than just economic trouble. Okay, so the China we all now know is a superpower, a world shaker. But that success it enjoys on the global stage comes as a result of its economic successes, much of which was spearheaded by the manufacturing industry. You would not be wrong to say that no other country in modern history has reshaped the landscape of global politics as China has done. On the back of the manufacturing, China rapidly transformed its economy from a low-cost factory to the world to a global leader in advanced technologies, all while transforming global supply chains drastically. It is no accident that China enjoys benefits on the global stage that can only be eclipsed by the United States, and in some cases, even that is debatable. China has won the game of international diplomacy, leveraging its success to become the primary trading and development partner for emerging economies across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Africa particularly has given China the platform to shine, further elevating the Eastern nation to a status of international dominance. When it comes to Africa, China has 4 overarching strategic interests. First, it wants and has had access to natural resources, particularly oil and gas. It is estimated that soon China will import more oil worldwide than the United States. To guarantee future supply, China is heavily investing in the oil sectors in countries such as the Sudan, Angola, and Nigeria. All of this is done on the backs of its economic partnerships. Second, investments in Africa. A huge market for Chinese exported goods might facilitate China's efforts to restructure its own economy away from labor-intensive industries, especially as labor costs in China increase. Yeah, hold that thought there. I'll circle back to this very soon. China also wants political legitimacy. The Chinese government believes that strengthening Sino-African relations helps raise China's own international influence, and this is actually happening. Most African governments express support for Beijing's One China policy, a prerequisite for attracting Chinese aid and investment. What is the island nation of Taiwan in the face of a $1 billion aid package, right? Finally, China has sought a more constructive role as a contributor to stability in the region, partially to mitigate security-related threats to Chinese economic interests. In that same basket, Africa looks to China for certain things. Several African governments look to China to provide political recognition and legitimacy, and to contribute to their economic development through aid, investment, infrastructure development, and trade. Where China shines in a way that even the US can't is that China, through its vast resources, as a result of its booming manufacturing sector, relates to African nations differently. Unlike most European and American aid packages, China only engages African nations economically without condescendingly preaching about good governance. It is hard to get a US aid package that does not tie in some sort of political favors, to African nations at least. China also funds high-risk projects and projects in remote regions that are not appealing to Western governments or companies. You would be well within your rights to say that corrupt politicians take advantage of this and also take a good portion of these packages to feast on. but it does not eliminate the fact that China sends the money. This relationship that China has managed to cultivate only through economic prowess can be traced back to its manufacturing industry. What I'm trying to say, in essence, is that China's rise in manufacturing has given it an economic advantage that has allowed it to blossom. The geopolitical relationships it has leveraged have elevated the country's status to an untouchable superpower. Powerful African nations like these have all borrowed from China, thereby putting them in a position where, though not obligatory, is more beneficial for them to advance Chinese dominance globally by pushing forward a Chinese agenda. China's economic power has also resulted in somewhat negative global implications. As more and more countries rely upon China's manufacturing industry to process or make certain goods at low prices, this has given China a position of leverage that to some degree has been abused. While this entirely depends on what angle you're looking at this from, under the reign of the CCP and President Xi, China has become more vocal about its power aspirations, and it has taken a more assertive international posture. This is especially so regarding Taiwan and China's several territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Combined with Beijing's military modernization program that has put Asia, as well as the United States, on notice that China's economic power will have geopolitical implications. Seeing how Russia recently abused its military might to invade a sovereign nation, none would put it past China to use its economic and military might to do the same. In fact, many say that China is using Russia as a blueprint for when they invade Taiwan. Also, because China is the economic powerhouse of BRICS, the BRICS group is gaining power and influence that is destabilizing the current world order. Whether that will be for the best or not is a topic I'll visit in a separate video. But the point is, China is most certainly, and has most certainly, changed the geopolitical landscape. None of this could have been possible were it not for the economic power that the nation derived from its manufacturing industry, which has both brought economic benefits and leverage to the Eastern nation. Now that we've established what manufacturing as an industry has done for China, let's dive directly into why the nation is facing a manufacturing crisis and what shall become of it. This is the juicy part. You don't want to miss this. If you're enjoying the video so far, I'm sure you'll enjoy my other videos, but according to YouTube, almost 70% of you are not subscribed? Please, take a second and subscribe down below. China's manufacturing crisis did not just emerge overnight, no. It was as a result of several factors that built up in the past few years. I won't go into every minor incident, but two main umbrella things deserve mention as they are accelerated by the collapse of China's manufacturing incident. What are they? Let's get into them. The first, of course, includes the US, because what's a little China without US rivalry?
We'll take you straight to the White House. The President of the United States announcing new trade tariffs against
China.
Trade tensions are flaring up between the U.S. and China.
Trump announcing plans to increase tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods.
I happen to think that tariffs for a country are very powerful.
A trade war. China is now punching back.
China has a 10-year, 20-year, 50-year plan. They've done some things that we don't agree with.
You have a chance to see the new Cold War.
China, due to the manufacturing and growth of its economy, has emerged as the sole rival to the United States' hegemony in the New World Order. In fact, when you measure the two in terms of PPP, otherwise known as purchasing power parity, China pulls ahead. All this naturally puts China at odds with the US and creates, well, some sort of tension. In 2019, China's total exports reached $2.5 trillion, with the United States being the top importer with nearly 20% share. Of course, importing so heavily from your competitor is not good for optics, so the US administration decided to impose a 25% tariff on selected goods from China. Trade deficits between the US and China are what had primarily propelled the imposition of these tariffs on China. The tariffs were followed by restrictions on both China's access to high-tech US products and foreign investments involving security concerns and by allegations of unfair Chinese commercial practices. This was not taken kindly by China, who retaliated in their own way, but the point is, the damage was done. When the country that imports a fifth of your goods pulls back even a little, you are bound to feel the effects. The US's actions on China, though improving things domestically, disrupted the global supply chain and slowed the growth of China's manufacturing industry. You can't keep improving and expanding when a fifth of your market vanishes overnight. The ensuing trade war that took place between China and the US was brutal, and it shook the financial markets of the world. Ultimately, though, it came to a heel and had heavily affected the relationship between these two top economic superpowers, drawing them both to a state of caution. In fact, I would be remiss to say the trade war is over. It is more like it has shifted to a Cold War, where tensions just run deep and paper-thin diplomacy protects the peace. And even when a new American administration came into place, nothing changed. Despite pleas from the US business community to ease tensions, US President Joe Biden so far has amplified Trump's policies by strengthening anti-China alliances and implementing additional sanctions. In fact, in October of last year, President Biden rolled out extensive new restrictions on China's access to advanced semiconductors and the equipment used to make them. These particular restrictions require an almost impossible-to-acquire license for the sale of advanced semiconductors to entities within China. This move, as was expected of it, largely deprives the Asian giant of the computing power it needs to train artificial intelligence at scale. The rules imposed also further cripple China as it robs them of their much-needed US talent, and it further cripples their own semiconductor supply chain. I have mentioned this before, semiconductors are the lifeblood of any manufacturing or even processing industry. Now that Biden has cut China off from that, well, it's a crisis. It is no exaggeration to say that about the two nations' political ties, this could be the single most impactful and substantial move by the US government to date in its quest to undermine Chinese technology capabilities. Its effects shall reverberate throughout the years, and we can only start to understand the extent of the damage as time moves on, and China falls behind other emerging hungry nations. In his eyes, Biden now characterizes the US-China conflict as a battle between the utility of democracies in the 21st century and autocracies. This all plays out negatively for China, as the US and their allies become less reliant on the nation as they start to look for manufacturing elsewhere. And remember, the money goes where the manufacturing is, and the money leaves where the manufacturing isn't. It really is just that simple. Now China is losing support for what it had made the backbone of its economy. This is the first factor that is resulting in the manufacturing crisis the nation is now in. The second major factor needs no introduction. We all know it, and it was quite a pandemic. Literally.
Chinese health authorities are still working to identify the virus in the central city of Wuhan.
At least 59 people are believed to have been sickened by the new virus.
Fast-breaking developments in the coronavirus emergency.
Wuhan, Shenzhen,
Beijing.
And a lockdown as COVID-19 spreads.
COVID-19 cases in China are surging, and that's leading to key factory closures.
Normally busy roads were hushed as most people acted on the government's new measures.
Factories have been closing down in China.
China is struggling with a rapid rise in new coronavirus infections.
Many of the country's 1.4 billion residents remain vulnerable to the virus.
COVID-19 quite literally reshaped the way the world does business. When it hit at its peak, the pandemic shut down the global supply chain, taking all of China's business with it. Question this: what happens to a country that is dependent on manufacturing the world's goods when, well, the world closes up shop? It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. It was an absolute disaster. China, which has arguably been hit the hardest by the pandemic, faced a severe closing of factories. Together with the CCP's zero COVID policy, a policy that was so bent on eradicating COVID that it heavily punished its own citizens, China just went downhill. By the time factories started trying to open again, the world had somewhat moved on. And now China was left to figure out the absolute disaster of a mess they were left with. In addition to that, the pandemic showed many multinational companies just how much they depend on Chinese manufacturing. This came as a shock, as many realized that everything, from raw materials to contract manufacturing to production facilities, were entirely based on the Chinese supply chain. In a bid to rectify that, so that unlike COVID times they would never be caught out in the rain, several multinational companies started looking for alternative locations. This brings us to one of the reasons why China is in a manufacturing crisis. Put simply, it is the change in micro trends. Everyone seems to be running out of China. But the question is, why? This is something we started to see seriously during the height of the US-China trade war. Because of the conflicts and the harsh measures the two countries were imposing on each other, companies from both countries suffered the brunt of it. This inevitably saw many major companies moving out of China in the search for survival. In fact, the country's export business was stagnant in 2019 for the first time in decades, and the impact trickled down to an array of industries. In fact, between 2018 and 2019, there was no noticeable trade growth, as you can see from this. This decline has only worsened as major companies continue to leave China. In fact, it has been estimated that around 40% of companies have relocated or are considering relocating their manufacturing out of China, according to a 2019 survey on tariffs conducted by AmCham Shanghai and the Chinese government.
So Hasbro, Nike, they want to leave the country.
Apple speeding up plans to shift manufacturing away from China, triggered by recent unrest in the nation.
Foxconn wants to boost its production in India as the company seeks alternative production sites outside of China.
Many of these nations are moving to other Southeast Asian countries, not just because of the push factors, but because of certain pull factors as well. In fact, when you analyze them in a nutshell, the manufacturing in China can be narrowed down to simply push and pull factors. Push factors that are pushing major companies and their manufacturing out of China, and pull factors that are attracting them to other places. Let's examine these together, shall we? Remember when I talked about the factors that led China to global dominance in the manufacturing space? Well, one of them was the low cost of labor. With a massive workforce, the biggest at that time, and super low cost of labor, China was unbeatable. Well, until now. You see, that low cost of labor China used to boast about is no more. The cost of production in China, especially in the major coastal cities, is on the rise, fueled by escalating wages and skyrocketing real estate rent and valuation. Labor costs alone have been growing 7% year over year for the past 5 years, and these are expected to keep rising. It makes sense, though. When a nation starts to develop and moves from developing nation to a developed nation, well, costs increase. As the cost of living goes up, so too do the wages of the workers. One thing that big companies like Nike or Adidas do not like is, well, high cost of production. As wages have risen, these major companies have started to leave China in search of better lands. Cheaper lands. This has seen a lot of big companies direct their attention to other nations that offer much lower costs of production. These nations include countries such as Vietnam and Indonesia that, unlike China, are still ridiculously cheap to produce goods en masse. In fact, let's talk about those countries for a little bit. I'll bring this home for a bit so we understand it better. Of all the exports that China has lost to the US market, more than a third of that has been in the hands of nations like Vietnam, India, and Thailand. These are nations that simply produce products at a much lower cost than what China does. I will now talk about how China is moving into high-value manufacturing soon, whereas these countries are still low-cost, traditional manufacturing countries. This means that for most companies, it is simply cheaper from a resource and labor perspective to move to other nations. And to be honest, this is the nature of business. Everyone wants to keep their costs low, and unfortunately for China, this is coming at the expense of their industry, as other countries take the bag from them. The largest beneficiary of China's manufacturing crisis is arguably Vietnam. Let's look at that in depth in just a few minutes. For now, we also have other factors that are in play in China's manufacturing crisis. Let's look at them. China's new direction is, well, not really helpful right now. China has decided to evolve its manufacturing into high-tech, high-value industry. Over the past few years, China has poured more than $1.5 billion into its Made in China 2025 strategy, in a bid to transform manufacturing into high-end tech-focused industry. The goal of this is to stimulate the creation of higher-level jobs that add more value to the manufacturing industry. What China is basically looking to do is substitute traditional low-margin manufacturing with innovative sectors, such as next-generation IT, advanced engineering, the Internet of Things, and smart appliances. This is meant to elevate China when it comes to the value chain. The powers that be in China have made this the new direction. Without a shadow of a doubt, China's manufacturing future is aimed at the higher value addition sector that is already on the rise. On the other hand, traditional labor-intensive manufacturing, which requires a low-cost ecosystem to flourish, will continue to diminish or be moved to other sectors. Long-term, this might be in line with what China as a nation plans to do, but in the short term, it's chasing away companies from the nation. The primary reason why most countries made their base there in the first place was because of the low cost associated with production in China, due to its traditional manufacturing industry. Their moving away from that is somewhat of a betrayal to companies that are attracted there because of that. It's like liking someone because their teeth look a certain way and then boom, they get braces. Though it is good for them, it takes away from that charm that brought you there in the first place. Hey, don't shoot the messenger. I'm simply letting you know why big companies are moving out of China en masse. Because of the uncertainty that sometimes comes with such massive sector changes, these big companies are starting to diversify and expand their manufacturing hubs to other geographies for supply security. This means that investments that could have been otherwise locked into China are now distributed to various places. This not only erodes China's position as the sole option for most of these countries, but it essentially diminishes the role that China plays in this chain. But to be fair, China's new direction is partially necessitated by the fact that, well, the nation's youth despise traditional factory jobs. And don't just take my word for it. Listen to this.
The limitless wave of cheap labor that helped propel the extraordinary boom in its economy is coming to an end.
China's economy is suffering from a strange mismatch between jobs available and the qualifications of the job seekers.
There's been a huge expansion in higher education, an enormous increase in the number of graduates.
This suggests a mismatch between supply and demand for low-skilled workers.
You don't find people who are willing to work in factories.
The upcoming generations of China have a deeply rooted resentment of factory jobs. And this is now contributing to a deepening labor shortage that is frustrating manufacturers in China. Do you see the irony of it all? A country of over 1.4 billion people has a labor shortage. Wow. I guess economics and the market have a sense of humor, don't they? The situation is so severe that more than 80% of Chinese manufacturers face labor shortages, ranging from hundreds to thousands of workers. In most cases, this is equivalent to 10 to 30% of these big companies' entire workforce. You can imagine how badly these industries are underperforming right now. China's Ministry of Education, which is notorious for biased estimates, forecasts a shortage of nearly 30 million manufacturing workers by 2025, larger than Australia's population. You can bet your bottom dollar that the actual figures are likely much higher. When all this is said and done, manufacturers say they have three main options to tackle the labor market mismatch. That is to either sacrifice profit margins to increase wages, invest more in automation, or move to cheaper pastures like Vietnam or India. As I've said before regarding cheap labor, Vietnam, India, and other nations are starting to prove to be the answer to this problem. So, since you guys have made it this far, I'm guessing you guys love keeping up with geopolitical news, right? Well, I've recently launched my own geopolitical newsletter called Global Recaps, where I send weekly emails covering the most important geopolitical news in a simple manner. You can sign up below, and best of all, it's completely free. There have also been several internal pressures that worked against China. For starters, the trade war, together with diminishing local industries and growing unemployment, have led some developed countries to offer subsidies and tax incentives to their local companies. This has been done in a bid to encourage their local companies to move manufacturing back home to boost the economy. This is a trend that has been forming more strongly in developed countries. Even in the US, we've seen this happening. starting from the Trump administration proposing tax credits for U.S. companies that relocate their manufacturing facilities to the United States from China. In Asia, Japan's $2.2 billion stimulus package aims to help manufacturers bring production home, or to other countries after the coronavirus pandemic disrupted supply chains and exposed an over-reliance on China. These examples are less of an equation of low costs and more a focus on navigating a geopolitical agenda and alleviating supply chain risks. Ultimately, however, they all add to the manufacturing crisis that China now has on their hands. Also, we have seen, especially in the US, a change in sentiment towards Chinese-made products. This might be particularly worse in America because of the trade war, geopolitics, the spying accusations, well, okay, you get the point. China doesn't have the best relationship with the US. In fact, according to a Reuters Ipsos survey, 70% of Americans prefer goods made in the United States. Now, the challenge remains that production in the US, or most developed nations, is still far higher than just exporting to other Asian nations. But still, those are factors that warrant a different discussion. Whether production is moved away to the US or Vietnam, the key point is that China loses either way, having been cut off from the conversation. Now, let's take a look at the winners amidst China's misfortune.
Now, India's growing prominence as a manufacturing hub gets yet another confirmation.
Foxconn wants to boost its production in India as the company seeks alternative production sites outside of China.
Samsung set up a plant in the Bac Ninh region of Vietnam to reduce its dependence on China.
Being in India is vital to Tim Cook and to Apple for the production.
Tesla has proposed to set up a factory to produce electric cars for local sale and export.
Thailand, Vietnam, and India benefiting from China's mistake.
I'm tempted to call these nations the nightmares of the CCP. But, I mean, that seems just a tad dramatic, right? Anyway, let's go through them starting with Vietnam. Vietnam alone has taken up over half of the US imports that shifted from China to other nations. This was such a huge market and opportunity for Vietnam that it has since boosted Vietnam's GDP by over 7.9%. This has been most notable in industries that have focused on the export of things such as furniture, footwear, apparel, electronics components, and machinery. To date, the US remains Vietnam's largest export market, accounting for 29.4% of total merchandise exports. Vietnam's exports to the US rose by 13.6% in 2022, with the bilateral trade surplus with the US increasing to $95 billion. Looks to me like Vietnam is coming for all that China has. What mainly appeals to the international community, and US companies specifically, is the nation's low labor costs. The very same advantages that drove China to greatness are now attracting a large pool of manufacturers to Vietnam. Several large manufacturing companies have announced plans to shift or expand manufacturing out of China and into Vietnam. This includes Foxconn, Apple's largest contract manufacturer, who signed a $300 million deal to expand in northern Vietnam with a new factory that will generate 30,000 jobs. This huge spending was in addition to the $1.5 billion that the Vietnamese government had said Foxconn had already invested in the country. Those sound like some pretty heavy investments, if you ask me. When you look at the facts of the matter, it becomes easy to see why. This excerpt from the New York Times puts it perfectly. A billboard outside a Foxconn factory in Bac Ninh advertised that the company is looking to hire 5,000 workers urgently, with an offer of roughly $300 in monthly payments for an entry-level position. It is less than half of the monthly pay, about 4,500 yuan or $650, that Foxconn is offering new hires at its assembly lines in Shenzhen in southeastern China. Yes, you heard that right. Vietnam employees in this instance are paid less than half of what Chinese employees are. What this simply means is that the cost of production in China would be substantially higher than in Vietnam. Any good businessman will tell you to expand operations where it's cheaper. In this case, that's Vietnam. Now you understand why Foxconn keeps investing in Vietnam. It too is looking to reap the benefits that come from cheap labor. Why pay more when you can get the same for free? Ugh, I bet some capitalist sweatshop is probably going to make that their new logo. I should probably take that back while I still can. What makes Vietnam's future bright is that it is not only more traditional labor-intensive industries such as apparel, footwear, and outdoor hard goods that are getting boosted in the nation. Much like we have seen with Foxconn and Apple, the electrical and electronics sector is set to become the next big thing to flourish in the nation. Even Samsung plans to move its display production out of China. And that's no small feat. This move alone will make Vietnam the world's leading display supplier. Just think about that. And let's just look at the numbers for a brief second. Due to its capitalization of China's manufacturing crisis, Vietnam has a strong economic expansion projected over the next decade. The nation's total GDP is forecast to increase from $327 billion in 2022 to $470 billion by 2025, rising to $760 billion by 2030. Those are not small numbers. All this translates to very rapid growth in Vietnam's per capita GDP, from $3,330 per year in 2022 to $4,700 per year by 2025 and $7,400 by 2030, resulting in a substantial expansion of the size of Vietnam's domestic consumer market. Vietnam has the opportunity and potential to become a juggernaut and more of a threat to China than it already is. Look out, China, Vietnam might just be your boogeyman in the making. Its role as a low-cost manufacturing hub is also expected to continue to grow strongly, helped by the further expansion of existing major industry sectors, notably textiles and electronics, as well as the development of new industry sectors such as autos and petrochemicals. Vietnam already has a domestic automaker of electric vehicles, VinFast, which launched its first EV in Vietnam in 2021. The company is growing, and as it does, it attracts competition, or in this case, manufacturing companies, to China. The last point to note when it comes to Vietnam is that its rise has been boosted by China's downfall, as the pandemic exposed, well, a lot of things. For starters, the world's big companies saw significant supply chain vulnerabilities during that period. Having seen the challenges that came with centralizing the global supply chains in China, most multinationals have been seeking expansion. And guess what? Vietnam has just been in a prime position to answer that call. And this issue is not closed either. It will drive the further reshaping of manufacturing supply chains over the medium term, as firms try to reduce their vulnerability to such extreme supply chain disruptions due to anything whatsoever. Add to all that the US-China trade and technology tensions still remain high, and what you have is the perfect concoction for the reconfiguration of supply chains. There is no doubt in my mind that Vietnam is going to come out as a winner from China's wires. But here's the kicker. They're not the only nation that stands to benefit significantly. India is another of the nations that are looking to capitalize on China's misfortunes. India, maybe more so than Vietnam, has a lot of things going for it. For starters, India boasts a large landmass and an abundance of labor due to its young population. This year, India surpassed China as the most populous country, and so they are covered in terms of labor. Unlike China, India's labor is not expensive, and hence they have the advantage. Certain companies have since noticed this and taken advantage. One example of this is Apple, which has already moved some of its iPhone production to the Indian states of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, and is exploring moving its iPad manufacturing to the South Asian nation. JP Morgan analysts even made calculations, and their projections show that 1 in 4 iPhones would be made in India by 2025. India is simply capitalizing on the vulnerabilities that COVID-19 exposed against China. The need for Apple to reduce its dependence on China as a manufacturing center has been clear for many years, but the impact of the pandemic at the world's biggest iPhone assembly plant underlined the problem. The COVID-19 related disruption was estimated to cost the company $1 billion weekly. It makes sense that Apple wants to avoid such a mess again. Julie Girdman, the CEO of Everstream, a platform for supply chain risk management, said in a statement, India has a large labor pool, a long history of manufacturing, and government support for boosting industry and exports. Because of this, many are exploring whether Indian manufacturing is a viable alternative to China. The Indian government is welcome to deals, as Indian Prime Minister Modi has been working on attracting foreign direct investments since he took office in 2014, sending FDI to a record $83.6 billion in the past fiscal year. With low-cost labor available, low cost of production, and a willing government, it's not hard to see why a good portion of business is leaving China for India. At the current rate, India stands to take a lot of China's business. And again, it's not the only one. We also have the land of Muay Thai. Thailand is perhaps an unexpected winner from China's manufacturing crisis. When you take a second look, however, you realize this was meant to happen. As Southeast Asia's second largest economy, Thailand has been moving up the value chain in manufacturing and is a production hub for car parts, vehicles, and electronics. Even major companies like Sony and Sharp have set up shop there. Sony said in 2019 it was closing its Beijing smartphone plant to cut costs and relocate some of the production to Thailand. Following that, Sharp said in the same year it was moving some of its printer production to Thailand because of the US-China trade war. All these actions prove that Thailand's competitive advantage keeps getting stronger, and hence multinationals are flocking to it. Now, before you start claiming that it's just foreign companies doing this, let me add this little fact. Even Chinese companies are moving out of China to manufacture elsewhere. Ugh, yikes. Companies producing solar panels, such as Shanghai's Jinko Solar, are moving their production to Thailand to take advantage of lower costs and avoid geopolitical tensions that China is always in the middle of. Amidst all of this, Thailand has just seen its foreign direct investments rise substantially. Between 2020 and 2021 alone, its foreign direct investments tripled, putting the country in a significantly better position. This was during COVID. One can only imagine the doors that will keep opening up for the country now that the global supply chains are being rewritten. And if you thought these were all the wins for Asia, you got another thing coming. We have other countries taking China's pie. Bangladesh is another of what you can deem China's competition. It has been a big beneficiary of the supply chain shift away from China, and its competitive advantage just keeps growing. The nation found its niche in the garment manufacturing sector, and it has heavily capitalized on this. The garment manufacturing industry is a key pillar of their economy, accounting for nearly 85% of shipments, or over $42 billion of the country's exports in 2021. The country is also the world's second largest garments exporter after China. Considering the size and resource disparity, that is quite impressive. Of its many advantages, Bangladesh's rise could perhaps be accredited to rising labor costs in China, whereas Bangladesh labor, in comparison, is significantly cheaper. Let me give you some numbers so you can really appreciate the difference. The average monthly salary of a worker in Bangladesh is $120, whereas in China it is $670. Say you owned a manufacturing company. Where would you rather set up in light of these costs? As Bangladesh continues to attract investments beyond the garment sector into other industries, I wonder how explosive their growth will and can be. Talking about explosive growth, let's look at Mexico. If you're not rooting for Vietnam, then you're probably on Team Mexico. What Mexico has in its hands is a golden opportunity as it stands to greatly benefit from China's manufacturing crisis. The North American nation is directly taking on China in the manufacturing market, and it's doing quite well at it. As US-China trade relations have continued to sour, it has been estimated by the UN that approximately $27 billion of lost trade between the two will be captured by Mexico. Yeah, you heard that right. That's billion with a capital B. And these aren't just random projections either, no sir. The food, basic metals, mining, pharmaceutical, and automotive sectors are projected to invest the most in the country. The latter a vital strategic part of North America's strategy to decouple its supply chain from the East and set up locally. Even Ford, the vehicle giant, has invested $260 million in its new global technology and business center in Mexico, while Volkswagen was reported to be investing an eye-watering $763 million in its electric vehicle plant. Flavio Barreros, managing director and Latin America supply chain lead at ActionSir, said in a statement, "There is mainly an upside to investing in the country, as North American manufacturers have a history of working cross-border with both Canada and Mexico, from raw materials through semi-finished goods to finished goods. Mexico will represent a key area of growth, representing 1/3 of new employment, particularly in automobile and food manufacturing." And you can't argue with how true this rings. I could talk about Malaysia and even other nations, but I'm sure you get the point. There are other nations whose own industries are on the rise, and any slip-ups by China are the windows for these nations to capitalize on and thrive on. Despite China's own slip-ups, these nations are emerging with just better competitive advantage, and that is giving them the platform to level up and potentially surpass China in the years to come. So, what are we left with at the end of the day? Let me state this unequivocally, lest there is a misunderstanding. As of now, China is still the world's factory. As much as there is emerging competition, China is still far above competing nations. Neither Southeast Asia nor India can replace China as the global manufacturing hub overnight. This is because they are mainly engaged in labor-intensive and low-value-added manufacturing, the very trend that China seeks to move away from. These emerging markets also don't have industrial chains and supply chains that are as complete as those of China. They might in the future, but I'm basing this off of today. What further gives China the edge that keeps them in the game is that they not only are a manufacturing hub, but China itself is a market for these goods. Based on its spending habits and large population, it provides the market for its goods. Don't believe me? In 2020, global companies had $1.4 trillion of domestic sales within the nation, far more than their exports of $900 billion. This means that they exported less than they sold. Tell me what manufacturer doesn't like that? That being said, countries like India boast similar advantages, or rather, the potential for similar advantages. Over time, assuming the same factors come into play, then yes, there is potential for such a drastic shift. In fact, the presence of nations like India is what is causing the manufacturing crisis in part from China. Only time will tell what will become of China's manufacturing industry as it is pitted against the younger but more competitive manufacturing industries of other nations. I will certainly work on an update as the situation evolves, but until then, only time can tell what will come of this globe-threatening manufacturing crisis.